Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. There's a certain kind of silence that only exists deep in the wilderness, an oppressive, heavy quiet that feels unnatural. I've been a park ranger for almost 15 years, but the stillness I was standing in that night made every hair on my body stand on end. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I'd gotten the call about strange animal sightings from a group of terrified campers 3 days earlier. At first, it seemed like the typical report we get from city folk who think every rustle in the bushes is a bear or mountain lion. They claimed they'd seen something stalking the woods at dusk, something big, with fur, moving on 2 legs. Their voices had that familiar edge of panic, the kind people get when they're way out of their depth in the wilderness. I almost didn't believe them. Almost. But when I hiked out to their campsite the next morning, their story felt a lot more believable. The tent was shredded. Not like the usual mess we see from bears, this was different. Deep, parallel gouges sliced clean through the thick fabric, like some massive animal had swiped at it with claws longer than my fingers. And the tracks. The tracks were what really got me. They weren't bear prints, they weren't even mountain lion or wolf. Hell, I couldn't match them to any animal I'd ever seen out here in the Rockies. They were huge, deep, and oddly shaped. Like a wolf's paw, but with an unnatural elongation, almost human in some ways. I felt it then, a gnawing sense of dread. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was still out there. I spent the next 2 nights patrolling the area, watching the tree line, listening for any signs of movement. Nothing. The quiet was almost worse than if I'd found something. No owls, no coyotes, no rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, just an eerie stillness. It was as if the forest itself had frozen, waiting. That's when I decided to head further up the mountain. There were rumors among some of the older rangers, stories passed around late at night about strange creatures seen near the higher altitudes. Most of us brushed it off as campfire talk. But now, standing there with those massive claw marks fresh in my mind, I wasn't so sure. I loaded up my pack, grabbed my rifle just in case, and started the trek. The trail wound through dense pines, the scent of wet earth and pine needles thick in the air. My boots crunched softly over fallen branches as I climbed higher, the world narrowing down to just the path ahead of me and the trees pressing in on either side. Around midday, I reached a clearing near the summit. From there, I had a perfect view of the valley below, a patchwork of greens and browns stretching as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, peaceful, but I didn't come for the view. I set up camp near the tree line, as far back as I could without losing sight of the clearing. Something about the forest felt wrong today. The quiet was back, the same oppressive silence that had weighed on me at the camper's site. No birds, no wind, nothing. I radioed back to base, letting them know my location and that I'd be out of range for the next 24 hours. That's when I heard the first snap. I froze, ears straining. The sound had come from just inside the trees, deliberate, like a heavy foot stepping on a branch. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, heart hammering against my ribcage. "Jason," I called out, though I knew it couldn't be him. My partner had gone back down the mountain hours ago. No response. The silence pressed in again. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the edge of the woods. Shadows danced between the trees, twisting and flickering like they were alive. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Just a glimpse of fur, maybe. But then it was gone. I stood there waiting, my finger tight on the trigger of the rifle slung across my chest. It felt like forever before I exhaled, releasing the tension in my shoulders. Maybe I was just jumpy. Maybe it was nothing. but I knew better. Night fell, and with it, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the fire crackling softly at my feet. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I scanned the tree line again and again, searching for any movement. My radio crackled to life, just static at first, but then a garbled voice came through. "You there? Hear me?" I grabbed the radio off my belt. "This is Ranger Scott. Repeat." More static. Then, "Not alone up there." My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" But the radio cut out, the static fading into silence once again. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was just interference, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. It came from just beyond the firelight, where the trees stood tall and dark like sentinels. I slowly turned, raising the rifle to my shoulder. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No response, just that growl again, closer this time. I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. I had to know, I had to see what was stalking me. I stepped forward, my flashlight sweeping over the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd been imagining things, but then, just at the edge of the light, two glowing eyes stared back at me. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and the way they reflected the light, it was unnatural. Slowly, deliberately, the creature stepped into view. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur. Its head was shaped like a wolf's, but there was something disturbingly human about the way it moved. It stood on 2 legs, its arms hanging low, tipped with claws that gleamed in the firelight. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. This thing, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. The creature let out another growl, baring its teeth, long, sharp, and yellowed with age. My hand trembled on the trigger of the rifle, but I didn't shoot. Not yet. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and calculating, as if it were deciding what to do next. I knew one thing for certain. I was in its territory now. I didn't belong here. Suddenly, it lunged. Instinct kicked in. I fired a shot, the crack of the rifle echoing through the mountains. The bullet hit its mark, but the creature barely flinched. It roared in anger, the sound so loud and visceral that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. I stumbled back, reloading as fast as my shaking hands would allow. Another shot, this one grazing its shoulder. It howled in pain, but it didn't stop. It was coming for me. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. The creature's heavy footfalls thundered behind me, its breath hot on my neck. I could feel it gaining on me, hear the snap of branches as it tore through the underbrush. Just when I thought it was over, that I'd feel those claws dig into my back, the growling stopped. I didn't stop running, not until I was halfway down the mountain, gasping for breath, my muscles burning. Only then did I dare to look back. The creature was gone. I don't know why it stopped chasing me. Maybe it was just toying with me, or maybe it decided I wasn't worth the effort. Either way, I wasn't about to stick around and find out. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, my clothes were torn, and I was covered in sweat and dirt. Jason took one look at me and went pale. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice hushed. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. Something's out there," I managed to say. He stared at me, waiting for more, but I didn't have the words to explain. How could I? How do you tell someone you just came face to face with a nightmare? All I knew was this: whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was still out there, watching, waiting. I don't go up that mountain anymore, and I sure as hell don't go alone. Story 2. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. Hell, it wasn't any animal I could identify. And that's when I knew my first solo night patrol as a park ranger was about to become a lot more complicated than I'd bargained for. My name's Akira Tanaka, and I've been working at Shadow Pine National Forest for just over 6 months now. It's my dream job, protecting the wilderness, educating visitors, and spending my days surrounded by towering pines and crystal-clear mountain streams. But tonight was different. Tonight, I was on my own. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with my flashlight, radio, and the vast, dark expanse of the forest. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I made my way along the trail, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful, serene even, until it wasn't. The first sign that something was off came when I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs had fallen silent, as if someone had flipped a switch. I paused, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Probably just a bear or mountain lion passing through, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my suddenly racing heart. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to cause other animals to go quiet, but something about this silence felt different, oppressive. I continued my patrol, moving a bit more cautiously now. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray on my belt, finding comfort in its presence. That's when I heard it, a loud crack of a branch breaking somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast darkness. "This is Park Ranger Tanaka. Is anyone there?" No response, just more silence. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my training. It was probably just a deer or elk, nothing to worry about. But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Another crack, this time closer. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees, and for just a split second I saw something, a shape, massive and dark, moving between two pines. It was gone so fast I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. My hand shook as I reached for my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Tanaka. I'm out on Trail 7 and I've got a situation here. Over." I waited for a response, but all I got was static. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, but nothing. The radio was dead. "Shit," I whispered, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest outpost, with no way to call for backup. That's when I heard the howl. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard before. It was wrong, somehow. Unnatural. I stood frozen, flashlight beam fixed on the spot where I'd seen the shape. My mind raced through possibilities, bear, cougar, but deep down I knew it wasn't either of those. This was something else entirely. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush snapped me out of my paralysis. Whatever it was coming closer. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my face as I veered off the path and into the thick forest. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. It was fast, much faster than it should be for something so big. My lungs burned as I ran, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was chasing me. In the back of my mind, I knew I was making rookie mistakes, running from a predator, going off trail, but terror had overridden my training. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, illuminated briefly by my wildly swinging flashlight, was a hulking shape, tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark fur, and those eyes, glowing an eerie yellowish green in the darkness. I let out an involuntary yelp and pushed myself harder, legs pumping furiously. Up ahead, I could see a break in the trees. The ranger cabin, my cabin, stood in a small clearing about a quarter mile from the main trail. If I could just make it there. The thing behind me let out another bone-chilling howl, closer now, too close. I could hear its labored breathing, smell a musky animal scent on the wind. My own breath came in ragged gasps as I broke through the tree line and into the clearing. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. I fumbled for my keys as I ran, nearly dropping them in my panic. Behind me, I heard a growl that sounded almost hungry. I reached the cabin door, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Come on, I muttered, glancing over my shoulder. The tree line was empty, but I could hear something moving in the shadows. Finally, the lock turned. I practically fell inside, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. For a moment, I just stood there, back against the door, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was dark and silent, but it felt like the safest place in the world right then. I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the small space with harsh fluorescent light. Everything looked normal. My small bed in the corner, the kitchenette, the desk covered in paperwork. It was almost enough to make me believe I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. A thud against the side of the cabin made me jump, then another. Something was out there, circling the building. I could hear its heavy breathing, the scrape of claws against wood. I grabbed my satellite phone from the desk. Thank God it wasn't in my truck, and dialed with trembling fingers. It rang once, twice. Shadow Pine Ranger Station. This is Mike. What's your emergency? I nearly cried with relief at the sound of my supervisor's voice. Mike, it's Akira. I'm at my cabin on Trail 7. There's something out here, something big. It chased me through the woods. I don't know what it is. There was a pause on the other end. When Mike spoke again, his voice was calm but serious. Are you safe right now, Akira? Another thud against the cabin wall made me flinch. I'm inside, but it's out there, circling the cabin. Mike, I've never seen anything like it. It was huge, covered in fur, walking on two legs. Okay, Akira, listen to me carefully, Mike said. I'm sending a team out to your location right now. They'll be there in about 30 minutes. In the meantime, I need you to stay calm and stay inside. Do not under any circumstances open that door. Do you understand? I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me. Yes, I understand. Please hurry. We're on our way. Just hang tight. The line went dead, and I was alone again. Well, not entirely alone. The thing outside let out another howl, so close it seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. I clutched the satellite phone to my chest like a lifeline. The next 30 minutes were the longest of my life. The creature continued to circle the cabin, occasionally throwing itself against the walls hard enough to rattle the windows. I huddled in the corner furthest from the door, my bear spray in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I tried to make sense of what I had seen out there. My mind kept going back to stories I'd heard. Legends of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Wendigo, but those were just stories, right? Campfire tales to scare tourists. They weren't real, except what I had seen out there was very, very real. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I heard the blessed sound of engines approaching. Truck doors slammed, and voices called out, "Akira! Are you in there?" I scrambled to my feet. "Yes, I'm here!" "Stay inside. We're securing the perimeter." I heard shouts, the beams of powerful flashlights sweeping across the clearing. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a knock at the door. "Akira, it's Mike. You can come out now." I opened the door with shaking hands. Mike stood there, looking grave, flanked by two other rangers with rifles. "Are you okay?" he asked, giving me a once-over. I nodded, stepping out into the cool night air. "Yeah, I think so. Did you see it?" Mike exchanged a look with the other rangers. "We found tracks," he said finally. "Big ones, like nothing I've ever seen before, and claw marks on the side of your cabin." I followed his gaze to the cabin wall. Long, deep gouges marred the wood siding. My breath caught in my throat. What do you think it was?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike put a hand on my shoulder. I don't know, Akira, but I've worked these forests for 20 years and I've never seen anything like this. Whatever it was, it's gone now, but I think it's best if you come back to the main station with us tonight. As we drove back through the dark forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere out there, in the deep shadows between the trees, something was waiting, watching. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't over. My first solo night patrol might be finished, but something told me my encounters with whatever stalked the forests of Shadowpine were just beginning. Story 3. The shadows seemed to breathe in the dense forest. As I swept my flashlight across the towering pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. This was my first solo night patrol as a rookie forest ranger, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. My name's Akira Tanaka, and I dreamed of this job since I was a kid. Growing up in rural Hokkaido, I'd spent countless hours exploring the wilderness. But tonight, the familiar forest felt alien and threatening. The crunch of pine needles under my boots was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. I paused, listening intently. Was that a twig snapping in the distance? My heart raced as I strained my ears. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoia creeping in. "Get it together, Akira," I muttered. "It's just your first night. Don't freak yourself out." I continued down the narrow trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. The cool night air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt ominous. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the edge of my light's reach, was a massive, shadowy form. It was hunched over, easily 7 feet tall even in its crouched position. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw gleaming eyes reflect in my flashlight's beam. Then it was gone. I blinked rapidly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Had I imagined it? The forest was still once more, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. "You're letting your imagination run wild," I chided myself. "It was probably just a bear or something." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever I'd seen had been standing on 2 legs, and it had moved with an unnatural quickness that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated, unsure whether to continue down the trail or turn back. My training told me to investigate any potential disturbances, but every instinct screamed at me to run. After a long moment, I steeled my nerves and pressed forward. The beam of my flashlight danced over the underbrush as I searched for any sign of what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boots. But it wasn't just their size that unsettled me. The shape was all wrong, too elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. "What the hell?" I whispered, crouching down to examine them closer. As I studied the prints, a twig snapped loudly behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing was there, but I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement in the shadows between the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice stronger this time. I unclipped the radio from my belt, my thumb hovering over the call button. "This is Ranger Tanaka. Identify yourself." More silence, but now I could feel eyes on me, boring into me from the darkness. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just come out where I can see you." A low, rumbling growl answered me. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, but certainly not human. The sound sent ice through my veins. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam darting frantically between the trees. Shadows seemed to shift and move with each sweep of the light. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. I'm just going to radio this in. No need for anyone to—" A deafening roar cut me off, so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground. I caught a glimpse of something massive, lunging from the shadows, all fur and claws and gleaming teeth. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore down the trail, my heart thundering in my chest. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Tanaka, this is base. Everything okay out there? We heard some strange noises." I fumbled for the radio, gasping for breath as I ran. "This is Tanaka. I need backup immediately. There's some kind of—" My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from my lungs. The radio skittered away into the darkness. Dazed, I rolled onto my back, expecting to see the creature looming over me. But there was nothing there. I lay there for what felt like hours, my chest heaving as I gulped down air. Slowly, the sounds of the forest returned, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, I managed to push myself to my feet. My hands shook as I retrieved my flashlight, casting the beam around warily. The forest was still once more. Whatever had chased me was gone. I found my radio a few yards away, miraculously undamaged. "This is Tanaka," I reported, my voice hoarse. "False alarm. I thought I saw something, but it must have been a deer or something. Sorry for the confusion." "Copy that, Tanaka," came the reply. "You sure you're all right?" I hesitated, glancing back the way I'd come. In the distance, I could have sworn I saw a pair of eyes gleaming in the darkness, but when I blinked, they were gone. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'm fine. Just got a little spooked. It won't happen again." As I made my way back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I told myself it had all been in my imagination, a rookie's nerves getting the better of him on his first solo patrol. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold some lurking threat. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, I was exhausted and on edge. As I trudged back to the ranger station, I debated whether to tell my supervisor what had really happened, but I knew how it would sound, a rookie ranger spooked by shadows and letting his imagination run wild. I'd be the laughingstock of the entire department. No, better to keep it to myself for now, at least until I had some kind of proof. The station was quiet when I arrived, most of the day shift not yet in. I made my way to the locker room, eager to change out of my sweat-soaked uniform. "Rough night, kid?" I nearly jumped out of my skin at the gruff voice. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with Ranger Holt, a grizzled veteran of the Forest Service. No, sir," I stammered. "Just, first solo patrol and all." Holt's eyes narrowed as he studied me. "Uh-huh. And I suppose that's why you radioed in about needing backup earlier." I felt the blood drain from my face. I thought I saw something, but— "Save it," Holt cut me off, holding up a hand. "I've been working these woods for 30 years. You think you're the first to see something you can't explain?" I blinked in surprise. "Sir?" Holt sighed, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Look, kid, there are things in this forest that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. You saw something out there tonight, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Thought so," Holt grunted. "You've got that look about you. The same look I had when I first encountered— well, let's just say you're not alone." "What was it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holt shook his head. "Hell if I know. Some call it Bigfoot. Others say it's something worse. All I know is that it's real, and it's dangerous." He fixed me with a stern gaze. "Listen to me, Tanaka. You need to be careful out there. Whatever this thing is, it's not to be trifled with. You got lucky tonight." I swallowed hard, nodding. What? What should I do? For now, keep your head down and your eyes open, Holt advised. Document everything, but keep it to yourself. The higher-ups don't want to hear about this kind of thing. It's bad for tourism. He clapped me on the shoulder. And if you ever need backup, real backup, you radio me directly. Understand? Yes, sir, I replied, feeling a mix of relief and dread settling in my gut. As Holt walked away, I slumped against my locker. Part of me had hoped that in the light of day, last night's encounter would seem less real. But Holt's words had confirmed my worst fears. There was something out there in those woods, something dangerous and unknown, and I had a feeling my nights of peaceful patrols were over. Story 4. The first thing I noticed about the valley was how quiet it was. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you get on a serene hike, but a heavy, oppressive silence that clung to everything, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Clara and I had been hiking together for years, but we'd never felt anything like this before. Do you hear that? Clara stopped mid-stride, her voice cutting through the stillness. Her gaze swept across the trees, eyes narrowing in the fading light. I paused, holding my breath. No. And that was the problem. There was nothing to hear. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, no insects buzzing. The kind of dead quiet that raises the hairs on the back of your neck, even if you can't quite explain why. I shifted the weight of my pack, feeling the straps dig into my shoulders. Maybe we're just too far off the main trail. No one's been here in years, remember? That's the point, Clara said, her voice low, almost like she didn't want to disturb the air around us. But this feels wrong. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Something felt off about this place. We'd been planning this trip for months. A deep hike into a remote valley in the Pacific Northwest, an area with no official trails, no real maps, just us, our gear, and a rough idea of the landscape based on old ranger reports. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to get away from the world. But now, standing there with the weight of that silence pressing down on us, I wasn't so sure. Still, I didn't want to freak out over nothing. Come on, we'll make camp soon. Get a fire going. We'll feel better once the sun's down. Clara nodded, though she didn't look convinced. We continued along the narrow path, the valley walls rising steeply on either side, casting long shadows over us. I glanced at the sky. The sun was sinking fast, painting the clouds in deep reds and oranges. We'd have maybe another 30 minutes of light before everything was swallowed by darkness. We should stop soon, I said, trying to sound casual. Clara didn't answer at first, just kept walking, her steps a little quicker now. Yeah, I think over there might work. She pointed to a small clearing just off the trail, a flat spot nestled between two large boulders. It was a decent spot, enough room for the tent, some cover from the wind, and close enough to the tree line for firewood. We dropped our packs and started setting up camp, the silence gnawing at my nerves the entire time. As I unrolled the tent, Clara stood still, staring into the trees. Do you think anyone's ever camped here before? I shrugged, not looking up from my task. Doubt it. This place is pretty remote. I mean, no animals, no people. Just us. Exactly, I said, trying to force some levity into my voice. Just us. We finished setting up the tent, gathered enough wood for a fire, and soon had a small blaze crackling between us. The warmth helped, but that unease still lingered just beneath the surface. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers pop and glow in the fading twilight. Clara sat across from me, knees pulled up to her chest. Do you believe in any of that stuff? She asked suddenly. I looked up, frowning. What stuff? You know, the stories about creatures out here. I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my ears. Like Bigfoot? She didn't laugh. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. People say they've seen things, right? But I've never put much stock in it. Clara chewed her lip, her eyes fixed on the fire. I used to think it was all bullshit too. But lately, I don't know. It feels different being out here, doesn't it? I glanced around, the shadows between the trees growing darker with each passing second. Yeah, maybe. But it's just our minds playing tricks on us. Long day, weird vibes. We'll be fine. She didn't respond, just stared deeper into the fire. I wanted to brush it off, but a chill crawled up my spine as the night crept in around us. The silence deepened, pressing in from all sides, as if the valley itself was closing in on us. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, and then it wasn't. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, not the light snap of a twig, but the heavy, deliberate sound of someone stepping on it. We both froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I slowly turned my head toward the tree line. Clara's eyes were wide, fixed on the same spot. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, every muscle in my body tensing. I scanned the edge of the trees, searching for movement, but the shadows were thick and impenetrable. "It's probably just a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. Clara shook her head. "That didn't sound like a deer." The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. Another snap, this one closer. I stood slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. "Stay by the fire." Clara didn't argue. She stayed seated, her eyes locked on the darkness beyond the clearing. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, flicked it on, and aimed the beam toward the trees. The light cut through the night, illuminating the trunks and branches. But there was nothing, just more shadows. Another sound, this time a low rustle, like something large moving through the underbrush. "Shit," I muttered under my breath, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. Clara stood up, her voice tense. "Should we pack up and leave?" Before I could answer, there was a thud. Something heavy hit the ground not far from us, like a rock being dropped or something large stepping out of the trees. The fire sputtered, sending up a shower of sparks. Clara gasped, backing away from the tree line. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "We're just passing through. We don't want any trouble." Silence. My flashlight beam caught something, a glimpse of movement between the trees, too fast to make out. But it was big. Too big. "Did you see that?" Clara whispered. "Yeah." Another thud, closer this time, and then breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate breaths, just beyond the reach of the light. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Clara, get to the tent. What about you? Just do it." She didn't argue, rushing to the tent and zipping it closed behind her. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, my other hand gripping the handle of my hunting knife. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. Whatever it was right there, just beyond the firelight, watching me. I could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze. My skin crawled with a primal fear, the kind that tells you to run before it's too late. But I couldn't move. Suddenly something massive stepped into the edge of the light. At first it was just a shadow, but then I saw it clearly, a hulking figure covered in thick, matted fur. It towered over me, easily 7 feet tall, its body impossibly broad, with long arms that hung low at its sides. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see the outline of its massive humanoid shape. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. The creature took another step forward, the ground shaking beneath its weight. It let out a low, rumbling growl, deep and guttural, the sound vibrating through my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the knife tighter, though I knew it wouldn't do me any good. The creature took another step, and then it stopped, its head turning slightly as if listening. For a long moment, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the trees, its massive form melting into the shadows. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly the sounds of the forest returned, crickets, the wind rustling the leaves. It was as if whatever had been holding the valley in its grip had suddenly let go. Clara unzipped the tent, her face pale. What the hell was that? I shook my head, still staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. I don't know. But deep down, I knew. We weren't alone out here. And whatever it was still watching us, waiting. We're leaving at first light, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded and we both huddled by the fire, neither of us daring to close our eyes. The valley had swallowed us whole, and something big was out there in the darkness, waiting for its chance to strike. We never spoke about what we saw after that night, but every time I close my eyes, I can still hear it, that slow, deliberate breathing. Story 5. The moment I saw it on the footage, my blood ran cold. There, in the background of a shot we'd filmed days ago, was a figure that shouldn't exist. Tall, hulking, covered in dark fur, and it was staring directly at the camera. My name is Dmitry Volkov, and I've spent the last decade chasing myths and legends across the globe. Ghosts, cryptids, UFOs, you name it, I've investigated it. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what we discovered while editing our latest documentary on the elusive Bigfoot. It all started 3 weeks ago when my team and I arrived in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. We were a small crew, just me, my camera operator Lena, our sound guy Marcus, and our wilderness expert Jack. We'd come armed with the latest equipment, determined to capture definitive proof of Bigfoot's existence. The first few days were uneventful. We hiked through miles of pristine wilderness, setting up camera traps and conducting interviews with locals who claimed to have seen the creature. It was the same routine we'd followed countless times before on similar expeditions. I'm telling you, Dmitry, Jack said one evening as we huddled around the campfire, there's something out there. I've been in these woods for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like the tracks we found today. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. The tracks had been impressive, over 15 inches long, with a stride that suggested something of immense size, but I'd seen convincing fakes before. We'll see what the analysis shows, I replied non-committally. Lena, who'd been reviewing footage on her laptop, looked up with a frown. Hey, did you guys hear that? We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, faintly, I caught it, a long, low howl that didn't sound like any animal I recognized. Marcus fumbled for his sound equipment. I'm getting this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The howl came again, closer this time. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. Jack's face had gone pale in the firelight. That's not a wolf, he said, his voice tight. Not a cougar either. I've never heard anything like that before. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but nothing came of it. The next morning, we found more tracks, fresh ones, leading away from our campsite. It was enough to send a shiver down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. We had a job to do. The following days passed in a blur of hiking, filming, and increasingly strange occurrences. We'd find our camera traps moved or destroyed, entire trees would be uprooted overnight, and always that haunting howl in the distance. It was on our final day of shooting that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. We were filming B-roll of the forest, with Lena panning across a particularly dense stretch of underbrush. And cut, I called. That's a wrap, people. Let's pack it up and head back to civilization. There was a palpable sense of relief among the team. As much as we'd all come hoping for a glimpse of Bigfoot, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest had taken its toll. We were ready to leave. It wasn't until we were back in our editing suite in Seattle that we noticed it. I was reviewing the footage with Lena, looking for the best shots to include in our documentary. "Wait!" Lena said suddenly, her hand shooting out to pause the playback. "Go back a few frames." I did as she asked, confused. "What is it? Did you see something?" Lena didn't respond immediately. She leaned in close to the monitor, her eyes wide. "There," she said, pointing to a spot in the background of the shot. "Do you see it?" At first, I didn't. The area she was pointing to was shadowy, partially obscured by foliage, but as I looked closer, I felt my heart skip a beat. There, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. A very large, very hairy figure. That can't be real," I muttered, but even as I said it, I knew I was wrong. We zoomed in, enhanced the image as much as we could. The quality degraded, but what we could see was unmistakable. A massive, ape-like creature standing upright, and it was looking directly at the camera. "How did we not see this when we were filming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lena shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know. It wasn't there, Dimitri. I swear it wasn't there." We spent the next few hours going over the footage frame by frame. What we found chilled us to the bone. The figure appeared in 5 consecutive frames, seemingly moving closer to the camera with each one. In the last frame where it was visible, it was close enough that we could make out details, long arms, a sloped forehead, and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I called an emergency meeting with the team. We gathered in the editing suite, the eerie images still up on the monitor. "This has to be some kind of hoax," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe someone in a suit." Jack shook his head. "No way. Look at the proportions, the way it moves. That's not a person in a suit." "Then what is it?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for her. None of us did. We'd set out to find evidence of Bigfoot, and now that we had it, I wasn't sure what to do. "We need to release this footage," I said finally. "The world needs to see it." The response was immediate and divided. "Are you crazy?" Marcus exclaimed. "Do you have any idea what kind of scrutiny we'll be under? Our careers could be over if this turns out to be fake." "But what if it's real?" Lena countered. "We have a responsibility to share this." Jack, who'd been quiet up until now, spoke up. "I think we need to be careful here. Whatever that thing is, it knew we were filming. It wanted to be seen. We don't know what we're dealing with." The argument went on for hours. In the end, we decided to sit on the footage for a few days while we did more analysis. We swore each other to secrecy, agreeing not to breathe a word of our discovery to anyone outside the team. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, those glowing eyes staring back at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that by capturing it on film, we'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. The next morning, I arrived at the studio early, determined to go over the footage one more time. But as soon as I walked into the editing suite, I knew something was wrong. The place had been ransacked, equipment smashed, hard drives missing, and there, scratched deep into the wall, were 3 words that made my blood run cold. "Don't show them." I called the police, of course, called the team. But as I stood there in the wreckage of our work, I couldn't help but feel that we'd stumbled onto something far bigger and far more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. The camera traps we'd left in the forest, we never retrieved them. Whatever footage they might have captured is still out there in those dark woods. And sometimes late at night, I swear, I can hear that same haunting howl, even here in the city. We set out to find Bigfoot. Instead, I think Bigfoot found us, and I have a feeling this is only the beginning of a much larger, much darker story. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a hulking figure lurking in the shadows of my own home. The footage is gone, destroyed in the break-in, but the memory of what we saw, what's out there, will stay with me forever, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in those deep, dark woods, something is watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, it's deciding what to do next. Story 6. The howl pierced the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote or any animal I could name. As it echoed through the mountains, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I thought I knew what I was getting into when I decided to go solo camping in the Cascades. Growing up in rural Oregon, I'd spent more nights under the stars than I could count. But as that unearthly cry faded into silence, I realized I might be in over my head. My small tent suddenly felt like flimsy protection against whatever was out there. I zipped up my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But sleep eluded me as I strained my ears for any sound in the oppressive silence that followed. Just before dawn, I must have drifted off, because I jerked awake to the sound of something large moving through the underbrush near my campsite. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Heavy footsteps circled my tent, accompanied by deep, guttural breathing. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a bear or mountain lion. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps receded. I waited until the forest sounds returned to normal before I dared to unzip my tent. The early morning mist clung to the ground as I cautiously emerged. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss, but as I circled my campsite, my blood ran cold. Deep claw marks scored the trunks of nearby trees, far too high to have been made by any normal animal. Some were still oozing sap, indicating they were fresh. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my fingers over the gouges. They were easily an inch deep, the wood splintered and torn. A twig snapped in the forest behind me, and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there, just shadows and mist between the towering pines. I took a deep, shaky breath. "Get it together, Elena," I chided myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But as I started to break camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. I was just shoving the last of my gear into my backpack when I spotted it, a tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, too thick to be human hair, but not quite like animal fur either. My hands trembled as I carefully placed it in a small plastic bag. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to pretend I'd never seen it. But my curiosity won out. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to hike back to my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A set of enormous, barefoot-like prints led away from my campsite, heading deeper into the wilderness. My first instinct was to run, to get back to civilization as quickly as possible, but something tugged at me, a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride. I'd come out here for adventure, hadn't I? "This is insane," I muttered to myself as I began following the tracks. "Absolutely insane." The prints led me off the main trail and into denser forest. I had to fight my way through thick underbrush, the branches seeming to grab at my clothes and hair. After about 20 minutes of tough hiking, I emerged into a small clearing. And there, at the base of a sheer rock face, was a cave entrance. I stood at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the scientist in me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged me forward. As I approached the cave, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was a palpable sense of wrongness about the place, an aura of menace that seemed to ooze from the dark opening. That's when I saw them. Scattered around the entrance were bones, lots of bones. Some were clearly animal, but others... I swallowed hard, fighting back a wave of nausea. Some looked disturbingly human. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "That's enough. Time to go." I turned to leave, only to find my path blocked by a figure emerging from the forest. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid, but far too tall and covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with gleaming yellow eyes fixed directly on me. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. Then, with a guttural roar that shook me to my core, it charged. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the forest, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. I burst out of the tree line near my campsite, my car just visible through the mist. Hope surged through me as I sprinted towards it, fumbling for my keys. My hands shook as I tried to unlock the door, acutely aware of the creature's approach. Finally, the lock clicked, and I dove inside, slamming the door just as a massive clawed hand swiped at the window. I jammed the key into the ignition, turning it frantically. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. "No, no, no," I pleaded, trying again. "Come on!" The creature circled the car, its yellow eyes never leaving me. It was even more terrifying up close, easily 8 feet tall, with powerful muscles rippling under its shaggy coat. Its mouth was filled with gleaming fangs, saliva dripping as it snarled. I turned the key again, but the engine refused to start. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I was trapped. The creature reared back, then slammed its fists against the hood of the car. The entire vehicle shook with the impact. Again and again it struck, each blow denting the metal. I scrambled into the back seat, knowing it was only a matter of time before it broke through. Tears streamed down my face as I searched desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. That's when I remembered the flare gun in my emergency kit. With shaking hands, I retrieved it and loaded a flare. The windshield cracked under the creature's relentless assault. One more blow, and it would shatter completely. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. As the creature's fist came down again, I raised the flare gun and fired. The flare struck it square in the chest, igniting its shaggy fur. The beast howled in pain and fury, stumbling back from the car. Not wasting a second, I lunged for the driver's seat and turned the key once more. This time, mercifully, the engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed onto the narrow forest road. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was the creature, still smouldering, disappearing into the tree line. My hands shook as I navigated the winding mountain roads, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened hit me. Tears streamed down my face as I pulled over to the side of the road, my entire body trembling. What the hell had that thing been? It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Part of me wanted to pretend it had all been a bad dream, to forget I'd ever seen it. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever that creature was, it was real and dangerous. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing. "Fish and Wildlife Service, how can I help you?" a bored-sounding voice answered. I took a deep breath. "I need to report an encounter in the Cascade Mountains." "What kind of encounter, ma'am?" I closed my eyes, seeing those gleaming yellow eyes in my mind. I'm not sure, but something's out there, something dangerous." There was a long pause on the other end. "I see," the voice said, suddenly much more serious. "Can you hold for a moment?" As I waited on hold, I glanced at the tuft of coarse hair I'd collected, still safely tucked in my backpack. Whatever that thing was, I had proof now. Proof that something unknown was lurking in those mountains, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Story 7. The elders warned me not to go near the eastern ridges after dark. I've been working this reservation for over a year, documenting wildlife for the conservation project, and I've heard all the stories. But I never paid much attention. Stories are just stories, right? That's what I thought until I heard my dead father's voice calling my name from the dark. I stood at the edge of the reservation, the setting sun casting long shadows over the rolling desert hills. The day had been long, hot, and uneventful. I'd spent most of it hiking out by the river, tagging a few elk, and jotting down notes for the biologists back in the city. Now, as the sky turned a deep orange, I felt the weight of the elders' words pressing on me. "Don't go near the eastern ridges after sundown," Chief Jonas had said, his dark eyes serious in a way that made my stomach flip. "Bad things live out there, things that take the shape of what you know." I'd nodded politely, the way you do when you respect someone but don't necessarily believe them. I was an outsider here, a scientist, not a local, but it wasn't my place to question the traditions of a people who'd lived on this land for generations. Still, I hadn't planned on letting superstition stop me from finishing my work. That was before the voice. It came just as I was packing up my gear, the wind picking up dust and swirling it around my boots. I'd been alone all day, not another soul for miles when I heard it. Soft at first, but unmistakable. My name. "Brandon." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. My father had died 3 years ago in a car accident, his voice one of the few things I could still hear clearly in my mind. But this wasn't a memory. It was real, carried on the wind. "Brandon." It came again, louder this time, closer. My heart slammed against my ribs. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the barren landscape. There was no one. Just the endless stretch of desert scrub and the rising hills in the distance. "Dad?" The word slipped out before I could stop it, my throat tight. Silence. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the creeping unease crawling up my spine. Maybe I was hearing things. It had been a long day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Yeah, that had to be it. But the feeling didn't go away. I shoved the last of my gear into my pack and slung it over my shoulder, the fading daylight casting everything in an eerie half-light. The ridges loomed in the distance, jagged and dark, like teeth rising from the earth. I turned my back on them and started the trek back to the truck. A sound stopped me dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Not the soft, shuffling sound of an animal, but deliberate, heavy footsteps, like someone walking barefoot through the dirt. My pulse quickened, and I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just the same empty landscape. I exhaled shakily, feeling foolish. It was probably just the wind rustling the brush, but as I turned to leave again, the voice came back, louder this time, more urgent. "Brandon." I whipped around, scanning the horizon. The sound was coming from the direction of the ridges, far off but unmistakable. My father's voice, clear as day. "Dad?" My voice came out in a hoarse whisper, the flashlight trembling in my grip. There was a pause, long and heavy. Then, faintly, "Come here." A lump formed in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My father was dead, buried miles away in a small cemetery back home. But something in that voice made me want to believe. Something deep and primal pulled at me, urging me toward the ridges. I took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. No, this wasn't right. The elders had warned me about this exact thing. Things that take the shape of what you know. I shook my head, forcing myself to turn away from the ridges. I wasn't about to let superstition get the better of me. But the voice didn't stop. "Brandon, help me." It was desperate now, pleading. My chest tightened, and for a split second I considered it. I considered following that voice into the darkness, just to see, just to be sure. Then a new voice, clearer and closer, broke through the fog in my mind. "You shouldn't be out here. I jumped, spinning around to see a figure stepping out of the shadows. It was Chief Jonas, his face grim, eyes hard. His presence was like a splash of cold water to my face. "Chief," I stammered, my heart still racing. I thought I heard something." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the ridges. "You heard something, all right, but it wasn't what you think." I frowned, confusion knotting my stomach. It sounded like my dad. Jonas let out a slow breath, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "That's how it gets you. It knows what you want to hear, what you're afraid of losing." A chill ran down my spine. What is it?" He looked at me then, his expression dark and unreadable. "Skinwalker." I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd heard the stories, tales of shapeshifters, beings that could take on the form of animals or people. I'd always thought they were just myths, stories to keep kids from wandering too far from home. But standing there in the dark, with Chief Jonas watching the ridges like they might reach out and grab us, I wasn't so sure anymore. "You need to leave," Jonas said, his voice low and firm, "now, before it decides to come any closer." I didn't need to be told twice. I nodded, my legs feeling like lead as I turned and started walking, the weight of Jonas's presence behind me. The silence pressed in on us as we made our way back toward the truck. The ridges loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, but I refused to look back. I didn't want to know if something was watching us from the shadows. When we finally reached my truck, I let out a shaky breath. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I dropped them in the dirt, cursing under my breath. Jonas stood by silently, his eyes scanning the tree line, always watching. Finally, I managed to get the door open. I paused, turning to Jonas. What happens if you follow it?" He looked at me, his expression hard. "You don't come back the same, if you come back at all." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "What does it want?" Jonas's eyes flicked to the horizon. "To take what's yours, your body, your mind. It feeds on fear, on grief. That's why it called to you." I shuddered, my hand gripping the doorframe. "But why me?" "Because you've lost something," he said simply. "It knows, and it'll use that against you." I didn't know what to say. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his words sink in. The voice of my father, it had used him, used my grief to lure me in. "Get some rest," Jonas said finally, his tone softer now, "and don't come back here alone." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I drove away, the truck's headlights cutting through the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that it was still out there, waiting for the right moment to call me back. The road stretched on, empty and quiet, the desert stretching endlessly on either side. I forced myself to focus on the road, to ignore the strange feeling crawling up my spine. But just as I reached the edge of the reservation, the radio crackled to life, the sound cutting through the silence. At first, it was just static. But then, faintly, my father's voice came through, soft and pleading. "Brandon, help me." I turned off the radio, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, but the voice lingered, echoing in my mind long after I'd driven away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ridges, dark and looming. I heard the voice, my father's voice, calling me back. And no matter how much I told myself it wasn't real, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home, something that wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Story 8. The first thing I noticed about the cave wasn't the darkness or the damp chill that seeped into my bones. It was the smell, musty and wild, with an underlying note of decay that made my stomach churn. But as I stood there, lost and alone in the wilderness, I knew I had no choice but to enter. What I didn't know was that by stepping into that cave, I was walking into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Yuki Tanaka, and until that day, I'd thought of myself as an experienced hiker. I'd tackled some of the toughest trails in Japan and had recently moved to the Pacific Northwest to explore its rugged beauty. But nothing in my years of outdoor adventures had prepared me for what awaited in those mountains. It had started as a simple day hike. The trail was marked as moderate difficulty, a 6-hour round trip to a scenic overlook. I'd packed light, just water, some energy bars, and my first aid kit. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. The first few hours were uneventful. I made good time, stopping occasionally to snap photos of the breathtaking scenery. It wasn't until I reached a fork in the trail that things started to go wrong. The signpost was old and weathered, the writing faded almost to illegibility. I squinted at it, trying to make out the directions. After a moment's hesitation, I took the left fork, confident it would lead me to the overlook. An hour later, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The trail had become increasingly overgrown, barely visible in places. The trees seemed to press in closer, blocking out more and more of the sky, and then suddenly the trail vanished entirely. I stood there, heart pounding, as the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down, trying to think rationally. I had no cell signal, and the sun was already dipping towards the horizon. I needed to find shelter, and fast. That's when I saw it, a dark opening in the rocky hillside. A cave. Relief flooded through me. At least I'd have somewhere to spend the night, out of the elements. As I approached the cave entrance, that strange smell hit me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the sound of distant thunder made the decision for me. A storm was coming, and I had nowhere else to go. I clicked on my headlamp and stepped into the cave. The beam of light seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing off the stone walls. I moved deeper into the cave, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. That's when I saw the claw marks. They ran along the wall at about shoulder height, deep gouges in the solid rock. My breath caught in my throat. What kind of animal could leave marks like that? I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the roughness beneath my skin. They were old, covered in a layer of grime, but unmistakable. Something large, something with incredible strength, had made these marks. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cave's dampness. I should leave, I thought. Find somewhere else to wait out the storm, but as I turned back towards the entrance, a low, rumbling growl froze me in place. It came from deeper in the cave, a sound so deep I felt it more than heard it. My headlamp flickered, the beam weakening, and in that moment of dimmed light, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. Large eyes, too large to belong to any animal I knew, and filled with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and then began to move, towards me. "No," I whispered, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. "No, no, no." I turned and ran, no longer caring about the uneven ground or the low-hanging stalactites. Behind me, I heard movement, the scrape of claws on stone, the sound of something large moving with surprising speed. I burst out of the cave entrance, gasping for air. The storm had broken while I was inside, rain lashing down in heavy sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark, terrifying clarity for a split second. And in that flash of light, I saw it. Just for an instant, but the image burned itself into my mind. Tall, impossibly tall, covered in shaggy fur, long arms that nearly reached the ground, ending in hands tipped with vicious claws, and that face, a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bear and man, with eyes that held an undeniable hunger. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't, because I could hear it behind me, pursuing me through the storm-lashed forest. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on. The sound of pursuit never faded, always just behind me, just out of sight. Finally, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep embankment. I landed in a shallow stream, the icy water shocking me back to full awareness. For a moment, I lay there, too exhausted to move, waiting for those claws to tear into me. But nothing came. The forest was silent, except for the patter of rain and the rush of the stream. Slowly, painfully, I sat up, looking around wildly. There was no sign of my pursuer. I don't know how long I sat in that stream, shivering and sobbing. When I finally gathered the strength to move, I realized I could see lights in the distance. Somehow, in my blind panic, I'd run in the right direction. Those lights belonged to the ranger station at the trailhead. I stumbled into the station nearly an hour later, a bedraggled, terrified mess. The rangers were shocked by my appearance and my wild story. They listened patiently, exchanging glances I couldn't quite interpret. "You're not the first to see something strange in these woods," one of them said finally. "But we've never found any concrete evidence." They sent out a search party the next day, but found no sign of the cave I'd described or the creature I'd seen. The claw marks I'd felt so vividly were dismissed as a product of my panicked imagination. In the years since that night, I've tried to convince myself that it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, but in my dreams, I still see those eyes glowing in the darkness. I still hear that growl that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I could swear I hear something moving out there. Something large, something hungry, something that remembers me. I don't hike alone anymore. In fact, I rarely venture into the wilderness at all, because I know now that there are things out there in the dark, things that defy explanation, things that hunt. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, it's going to find me again. That my escape from that cave was only temporary, that out there in the vastness of the wilderness, something is waiting, watching, hungry, and patient. So very, very patient. Story 9. The moment I saw it, I knew my life would never be the same. Standing there in the misty forest clearing, rifle frozen in my hands, I watched as a creature that shouldn't exist loped away on 2 legs. My hunting dog, Bandit, barked furiously beside me, his hackles raised and teeth bared at the retreating figure. "I'm Malik Abadi, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a gun. I thought I knew every animal, every track, every sound in this forest. But what I saw that day defied explanation. It had started as a typical hunting trip. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Bandit and I made our way deeper into the wilderness. We were tracking a buck I'd spotted earlier, its tracks fresh in the soft ground. "Easy, boy," I murmured as Bandit strained at his leash, nose to the ground. "We're close now." The forest was unusually quiet, I realized. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, Bandit's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the trees. "You got something?" That's when I heard it, a sound like breaking branches, but much too loud for a deer. Whatever was moving through the forest was big, and it was heading our way. I raised my rifle, heart pounding as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. Bandit's growl deepened, his body tense and ready to spring. The undergrowth parted, and for a moment I thought I was looking at a bear. But as it emerged into the clearing, I realized how wrong I was. It stood on 2 legs, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in dark, shaggy fur. But it wasn't the size that froze me in place. It was the face. a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with intelligent eyes that locked onto mine with unsettling awareness. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, we stared at each other. Then Bandit's frenzied barking shattered the moment. The creature's head snapped towards the dog, lips pulling back to reveal gleaming fangs. With shocking speed, it turned and bounded away, disappearing into the dense forest. "Heel!" I shouted, struggling to hold Bandit back as he lunged against his leash. "Stay, damn it!" But Bandit was beyond listening. With a final, powerful jerk, he tore free of my grip and shot off after the creature, his baying echoing through the trees. "Bandit!" I yelled, my voice tinged with panic. "Come back!" I plunged into the forest after them, branches whipping at my face as I ran. The sound of Bandit's barking grew fainter, driving me to push harder. "This is insane!" I gasped as I stumbled over a fallen log. "What the hell was that thing?" As I paused to catch my breath, something caught my eye. There, snagged on a low-hanging branch, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. With trembling hands, I carefully removed it, holding it up for closer inspection. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too thick to be human hair, but not quite like any animal fur I knew. I tucked it safely into my pocket, knowing it might be the only proof of what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the tracks, huge, barefoot-like prints pressed deep into the soft earth. But they were all wrong, too large for a human, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. "Jesus," I muttered, crouching down to examine them closer. "What are you?" A distant yelp of pain cut through the air, snapping me back to the present. "Bandit!" I took off running again, following the tracks as they led deeper into the wilderness. The forest grew denser, the ancient trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst into another clearing. Bandit was there, thankfully alive but clearly shaken. He limped towards me, whimpering softly. "Easy, boy," I soothed, quickly checking him over. There was a nasty gash on his flank, but it didn't look too deep. What happened? Where did it go? Bandit's only response was to press closer to my legs, his tail tucked between his legs. Whatever he'd encountered had thoroughly spooked my usually fearless hunting dog. I scanned the clearing, my rifle at the ready. That's when I saw it, a cave entrance, half hidden by thick vegetation. The tracks led straight towards it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get Bandit to safety, and forget this whole insane encounter. But something pulled me forward, a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride that overrode my common sense. "Stay close," I told Bandit as we approached the cave. He whined softly but followed, pressing against my leg. The cave mouth loomed before us, a yawning black void that seemed to swallow the daylight. The air flowing out was damp and musty, carrying an odd, musky scent I couldn't place. I fumbled for the flashlight in my pack, its beam barely penetrating the inky darkness. As we moved deeper into the cave, the temperature dropped noticeably. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it as my voice echoed off the stone walls. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. We'd gone about 50 yards in when Bandit suddenly froze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I swept the flashlight beam around, my heart racing. That's when I saw them, claw marks deep and fresh, scoring the cave walls. They were easily an inch deep, the stone gouged and splintered. "What the hell could do this?" I whispered, running my fingers over the marks. A low, rumbling growl answered me, and it didn't come from Bandit. I whirled around, the flashlight beam catching a pair of gleaming eyes in the darkness behind us. They were set too high to be human, yellow and filled with predatory intelligence. "Oh, shit," I breathed, slowly backing away. "Easy now. We're leaving. We don't want any trouble." The eyes blinked, then began to move forward. As the creature emerged into the edge of the flashlight's beam, I got my first clear look at it. It was even more terrifying up close. easily 8 feet tall, with powerful muscles rippling under its shaggy coat. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, those intelligent eyes fixed on me with unnerving focus. Bandit snarled, placing himself between me and the creature, but I could feel him trembling against my leg. "Back off!" I shouted, raising my rifle. "I don't want to shoot you, but I will if I have to." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it understood my words. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of gleaming fangs, and let out a roar that shook dust from the cave ceiling. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked back, more in surprise than pain, then charged forward with shocking speed. "Run!" I yelled to Bandit, turning to flee. We sprinted towards the cave entrance, the creature's thunderous footsteps close behind. We burst out into the daylight, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I risked a glance back, expecting to see the monster right on our heels. But the cave entrance was empty. The creature had stopped at the threshold, glaring at us from the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would follow. Bandit and I tore through the forest, not stopping until we reached my truck parked on the logging road. As I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the image of those intelligent, predatory eyes. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something more. I slammed the truck into gear and peeled out, gravel spraying as we fishtailed onto the road. Bandit whined softly from the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the trees rushing past. My mind raced as I drove, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Part of me wanted to forget it all, to pretend it had never happened. But I knew I couldn't, not with the tuft of hair still in my pocket, and the memory of those claw marks burned into my brain. As we hit the main highway, I pulled out my phone. My finger hovered over the contact for the local Fish and Wildlife office. They needed to know what was out there, but would they believe me? Or would I be labeled as just another crackpot seeing Bigfoot in the woods? I put the phone down, my jaw set with determination. No, I needed more proof first. I'd go back, better prepared this time. Whatever that creature was, I was going to find it again. And next time, I'd be ready. Story 10. The first night we heard it, we thought it was just the wind, howling low and deep through the trees, echoing off the mountains. But by the second night, we knew better. Something was out there, watching us from the dense, dark forest, and the more we tried to ignore it, the closer it seemed to come. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the weight of the forest pressing in around us as the last light of day slipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the ground. It was supposed to be a routine trip, me and the rest of the wildlife survey team, deep in the heart of the national park, documenting animal populations. A week out here, away from civilization, with nothing but nature for company. But after what we'd heard last night, none of us were feeling relaxed. I sat on a log near the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. The others, Jenny, Rob, and Greg, were scattered around the campsite, each of them doing their best to act like everything was normal, but the tension was palpable. "You hear it again?" Greg asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. I glanced up at him, nodding. "Yeah, same as last night." Rob, who was crouched by the fire with a pot of coffee, didn't look up. "Could be anything," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Mountain lions, wolves, hell, even a deer can make noise like that when they're spooked." "That didn't sound like any mountain lion I've ever heard," Jenny said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the dark tree line. I didn't disagree. The noise had been low, almost a guttural howl, carrying across the valley like a warning. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end just thinking about it. The sound was wrong. It was too deep, too deliberate, like something massive was lurking just out of sight, waiting. "We're in their territory," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever it is, it's just curious. We've probably been the first humans out here in years." Curious? Jenny scoffed, hugging her jacket tighter around herself. It sounded more like it was pissed. I forced a laugh, but it fell flat. We've all been in the woods long enough to know animals make weird noises at night. We don't know what it was, but even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Last night, after the sound had echoed through the trees, we'd gone out to investigate. Rob had insisted it was just an animal, a large one, sure, but nothing to worry about. But when we found those trees, something had changed. They'd been snapped. Not just broken branches, but massive trunks twisted and splintered like toothpicks. No claw marks, no signs of a struggle, just destruction. And there were the footprints, huge, deep, and unmistakably bipedal. Far too large to belong to a bear or even a human. It was something else, something we couldn't explain. Greg sighed, standing up from his log and brushing dirt from his pants. We'll keep the fire going. If anything comes close, we'll hear it. Or smell it, Rob added with a smirk, though none of us found it funny. His bravado was wearing thin, and I could see the unease in his eyes every time he glanced toward the trees. Jenny moved closer to the fire, sitting beside me. I don't like this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent years out in the woods, but this feels different. Yeah, I agreed quietly. It does. The night was closing in fast, the dark settling over the forest like a heavy blanket. The firelight danced on the edges of the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, every crack of a twig or rustle in the underbrush making my pulse quicken. We sat in tense silence for a while, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the oppressive quiet of the forest. Rob handed out cups of coffee, and we sipped in uneasy companionship, each of us listening, waiting. Then it came again, that same low, guttural howl, this time closer. We all froze, eyes snapping to the tree line. The sound reverberated through the ground, sending vibrations up through the soles of my boots. It was deeper now, more intense, like it was coming from something massive, something alive. Jesus Christ, Greg muttered, standing up slowly, his eyes wide. That's not a wolf. Rob shot to his feet, grabbing the flashlight from his pack. I'm going to check it out. You're insane, Jenny hissed, grabbing his arm. You're not going out there. He shrugged her off, his jaw tight. We can't just sit here and wait for whatever it is to come to us. I stood too, grabbing my own flashlight. He's right. We need to know what we're dealing with. Greg shot me a look, his face pale. Are you serious? Do you have a better idea? I asked, my voice harder than I intended. We're days from the nearest town, and we're not leaving until we know we're safe. If there's something out there, we need to be prepared. Jenny looked between us, her face tight with fear. Fine, she said, standing up and crossing her arms, but I'm staying here. I'm not walking into the dark with whatever that thing is. Stay by the fire, I said, glancing at her. We won't go far. Rob handed her a can of bear spray, just in case. She nodded, her hand trembling as she took it. Greg reluctantly grabbed his own flashlight, and the three of us headed toward the trees, the beams of our lights cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. We needed to know. The forest swallowed us as soon as we stepped beyond the firelight. The towering trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like a dense, impenetrable ceiling. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of twigs, the distant rustle of something moving just out of sight. Keep your eyes open, Rob muttered, his voice tense. We moved slowly, carefully, our flashlights sweeping the ground for any signs of movement. The howling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like a pair of unseen eyes were tracking our every step. Then we found it. The trees. Just like before, they were snapped. 3 of them, their thick trunks splintered and twisted at odd angles. It looked like a bomb had gone off, sending branches flying in every direction. The ground was torn up, the dirt gouged as if something massive had been through here. But it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. Huge, deep impressions in the soft earth, spaced far apart. Whatever had made them was walking on two legs, but they were far too large to be human. Each print was easily twice the size of my boot, and the depth suggested a weight that was impossible. "Jesus," Greg whispered, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is that?" I crouched down, running my hand over the edge of one of the prints. "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. "But it's big." Rob stood a few feet away, his flashlight pointed at the broken trees. "We need to get out of here," he said, his bravado gone. "Whatever this is, it's not something we can handle." I nodded, standing up. "Let's head back." But as we turned to leave, a sound stopped us in our tracks. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from deeper in the forest. The ground seemed to vibrate with each step, the sound growing louder, closer. My heart raced, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Go," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted back toward the camp. My lungs burned, my legs aching as I pushed myself harder, faster. Behind us, the footsteps followed, slow, steady, and relentless. We burst out of the trees, stumbling into the clearing where Jenny stood by the fire, her eyes wide with terror. "Run!" Rob shouted, grabbing her arm. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just ran, through the clearing, down the trail, away from whatever was following us. The footsteps faded as we put distance between us and the camp, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us, and it wasn't going to let us leave that easily. We made it to the ranger station the next day, exhausted and shaken. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, not to the rangers, not to each other. But the memory of those footsteps, of those massive prints in the dirt, stayed with me. And even now I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Story 11. The moment I saw those eyes staring back at me from the camera footage, I knew my life would never be the same. They were intelligent, piercing, and unmistakably inhuman. In that instant, everything I thought I knew about the natural world shattered, leaving me with a truth too terrifying to comprehend. My name is Omar Rashid, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators. For the past decade, I've studied everything from wolves in Yellowstone to tigers in India. But nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I discovered in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. It all started 3 months ago when I received a grant to study the impact of climate change on predator populations in the region. I was excited about the project. It was a chance to spend 6 months in one of the most pristine wilderness areas left in North America. I arrived in early spring, just as the last of the snow was melting from the higher elevations. My base camp was a small cabin on the edge of a vast national forest, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by the kind of untouched wilderness that's becoming increasingly rare in our world. The first few weeks were uneventful. I set up my equipment, a network of motion-activated cameras designed to capture images of passing wildlife. Every few days, I'd hike out to check the cameras, swap out memory cards, and replenish the bait stations. It was on one of these routine checks that I first noticed something odd. Camera 7, positioned near a game trail about 5 miles from my cabin, had been moved. Not knocked over by an animal or blown by the wind, but deliberately repositioned to point in a different direction. I frowned, studying the disturbed ground around the tree where the camera had been mounted. There were tracks, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen before, too large for a bear, with a strange, almost human-like shape to them. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching down for a closer look. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I spun around, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive, watchful silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly gathered my equipment and headed back to the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that I was being observed. That night, as I reviewed the footage from camera 7, my unease grew. Most of it was normal: deer, elk, the occasional black bear. But there was one clip, just a few seconds long, that made my blood run cold. It showed a large, dark shape moving through the frame. The quality wasn't great. It was night footage, illuminated only by the camera's infrared. But what I could see didn't make sense. The figure was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, walking on 2 legs. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size, and then it turned, looking directly at the camera. Those eyes. I replayed the clip dozens of times, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a bear, I told myself, a trick of the light and shadow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I hiked back out to camera 7, determined to find a logical explanation. But what I found only deepened the mystery. The camera was gone, torn from its mounting. All that remained were deep gouges in the tree bark, as if something with immense strength had simply ripped it away. I stood there, staring at the marks, when a low, rumbling growl broke the silence. It came from somewhere behind me, a sound so deep I felt it in my chest. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood something that shouldn't exist. It was massive, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, almost reaching the ground, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a bizarre blend of ape and man, with eyes that burned with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it let out a roar that shook the trees and charged. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sound of pursuit was right behind me, an unstoppable force of nature bearing down with terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but still I pushed on. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and saw my cabin ahead. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted for the door, fumbling with the keys as the creature's roars grew closer. I practically fell inside, slamming the door shut and throwing the deadbolt. For several minutes I just stood there, gasping for breath, listening. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, accompanied by deep, guttural breathing. Then, silence. The rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and disbelief. I pored over my research, searching for any reference to a creature that matched what I'd seen. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? The legends existed, but I'd always dismissed them as folklore. Now, I wasn't so sure. As night fell, the noises started again. Something large moving around the cabin, testing the walls and windows. I huddled in the center of the room, clutching my satellite phone, debating whether to call for help. But who would believe me? The attack came just before dawn. The creature threw itself against the door with a force that made the whole cabin shudder. Wood splintered, hinges groaned. I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my camera and started recording. "My name is Dr. Omar Rashid," I said, my voice shaking as another impact rocked the cabin. "I'm a wildlife biologist working in—" The door gave way with a thunderous crash, and I found myself face to face with the impossible. What happened next is a blur. I remember a flurry of movement, a pain in my arm as claws raked across it. I remember the overpowering smell, musty and wild, with an underlying scent that was disturbingly human. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The creature was gone, leaving behind a wrecked cabin and a shaken biologist with far more questions than answers. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I reviewed what little footage I had, catalogued the physical evidence, the tracks, the claw marks, my own injuries, but the more I studied it, the less sense it made. I considered going public with my findings, but the rational, scientific part of my brain held me back. I had no concrete proof, nothing that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as a hoax. And the scientific community isn't kind to those who make extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. So I find myself at a crossroads. Do I continue my research, knowing the dangers that lurk in these woods? Do I walk away, try to forget what I've seen? Or do I dig deeper, seek out the truth behind the legends? One thing is certain. I can never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, creatures that defy explanation, and they're watching us, studying us, just as we study them. As I sit here in my repaired cabin, writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being observed. Sometimes, late at night, I hear movement in the forest, and when I look out the window, I swear I can see eyes glinting in the darkness, intelligent, curious, and unmistakably inhuman. Whatever I encountered out there, whatever it is that stalks these woods, one thing is clear. We are not alone. And we are not at the top of the food chain, not out here in the wild places of the world where ancient creatures still roam. The question now is, what do I do with this knowledge? And more importantly, what will they do now that they know they've been discovered? Only time will tell. But one thing's for certain. The forests will never seem the same to me again. Every shadow could hide a secret, every unexplained sound could be a warning, and those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, they'll haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Story 12. The figure stood motionless at the edge of the tree line, its unnaturally tall and thin silhouette a stark contrast against the misty forest backdrop. I blinked, and in that split second, it vanished. But the feeling of being watched lingered, sending chills down my spine. My name is Yuki Tanaka, and I've been hiking these trails since I was a kid. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered that day. The morning had started like any other solo hike. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I made my way along the familiar path, fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, a peaceful symphony that usually set my mind at ease. But today, something felt off. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were following my every move, hidden just beyond the veil of mist that clung to the trees. I paused to take a swig from my water bottle, scanning the forest around me. That's when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still among the trees, easily 7 feet tall and impossibly thin. For a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light or an oddly shaped tree. Then it moved. It was just a slight shift, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I blinked instinctively, and when my eyes opened again, the figure was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the suddenly oppressive silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the birds had stopped singing. The forest held its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. "Get it together, Yuki," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. I picked up my pace, the peaceful hike turning into something more urgent. The trail ahead wound through a particularly dense section of forest, the trees pressing in close on either side. As I entered this natural tunnel, the mist seemed to thicken, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Show yourself." Silence answered me, broken only by my own rapid breathing. But as I peered into the mist, I could have sworn I saw movement, a tall, thin shape flitting between the trees. "This isn't funny," I shouted, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "If this is some kind of prank, it's not cool." As if in response, a low, inhuman moan echoed through the forest. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, but certainly not human. The sound sent ice through my veins. That's when I ran. I tore down the trail, branches whipping at my face as I sprinted through the mist. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, legs pumping furiously. Up ahead, I could see the mist thinning, sunlight breaking through. Just a little further to the clearing where I'd parked my car. I burst out of the tree line, relief flooding through me as I spotted my beat-up Honda at the edge of the small parking area. But as I fumbled for my keys, a movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. There, at the edge of the forest, stood the figure. In the clear light of day, I could see it wasn't human at all. Its body was impossibly elongated, skin a sickly pale color that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Its face. I shuddered, trying to block out the memory of those features that were almost, but not quite, human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then with a fluidity that defied physics, it melted back into the forest shadows. My hands shook as I unlocked the car, practically diving inside and slamming the door. As I jammed the key into the ignition, movement caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I saw long, pale fingers slide across the hood of my car, leaving deep gouges in the metal. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed onto the narrow forest road. In my rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the creature standing in the middle of the parking area, its elongated arm reaching towards the retreating car. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As the adrenaline began to fade, I noticed an odd smell in the car. A musty, almost chemical odor that hadn't been there before. That's when I saw it, a small scrap of pale shimmer fabric caught in the doorframe. With trembling fingers, I carefully removed it, holding it up for inspection. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, not quite cloth, not quite skin. It seemed to shift and move in my hand, as if it were alive. I pulled over to the side of the road, my entire body shaking as the full weight of what had happened hit me. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to process the impossible encounter. Part of me wanted to pretend it had all been a bad dream, to forget I'd ever seen that thing. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever that creature was, it was real and dangerous. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number I never thought I'd use. "Paranormal Research Institute, how can I help you?" A bored-sounding voice answered. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I need to report an encounter in the Haida Mountains." There was a long pause on the other end. "What kind of encounter?" the voice asked, suddenly much more alert. I closed my eyes, seeing those inhuman features in my mind. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen." "I see," the voice said slowly. "Can you hold for a moment? I need to transfer you to our Special Cases Division." As I waited on hold, I glanced at the scrap of strange material I'd collected, still clutched in my hand. Whatever that thing was, I had proof now, proof that something unknown was lurking in those mountains. "Ms. Tanaka," a new voice came on the line, deep and authoritative. "This is Agent Yamamoto. I understand you've had an unusual experience. Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" I hesitated, wondering if I should really be doing this. but the memory of those impossible fingers sliding across my car hood steeled my resolve. "It started when I was hiking in the Hida Mountains," I began, my voice shaky but growing stronger as I spoke. "I saw something that shouldn't exist." As I recounted my experience, I could hear the agent typing rapidly on the other end of the line. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. "Ms. Tanaka," Agent Yamamoto said finally, his voice grave, "what you've described matches several other reports we've received from that area. We've been investigating these incidents for some time now." My heart raced at his words. "So you believe me? You know what this thing is?" "We have theories," he replied cautiously, "but we need more information. The sample you collected could be crucial to our investigation. Are you willing to meet with our team?" I glanced at the shimmering scrap in my hand, then at the deep gouges on my car hood. Whatever this thing was, it was dangerous, and it was still out there. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes to figure out what's going on in those mountains." "Excellent," Agent Yamamoto said. "We'll send a team to meet you immediately. And Ms. Tanaka, thank you for coming forward. You may have just helped us crack a case that's been puzzling us for years." As I ended the call, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just changed irrevocably. Whatever that creature was, whatever was happening in those mountains, I was now a part of it, and somehow I knew this was only the beginning. Story 13. The first time we saw him, he was just a shadow against the horizon, standing motionless on the trail ahead. I squinted into the desert sun, trying to make out his shape, but something about him, about the way he just stood there, made my skin crawl. Luke and I had hiked this trail dozens of times, but I'd never seen anyone like him out here. And the worst part was, no matter how long we walked, he never seemed to get any closer. It was supposed to be a routine trip, just a quick weekend hike through the Arizona desert. The kind of thing Luke and I had done 100 times before. The trail was isolated, sure, but we'd always loved that. No tourists, no noise, just miles of open space and quiet. Usually, the only thing we had to worry about was the heat or running into a rattlesnake. But this time felt different. We'd been walking for a couple of hours when we first noticed him. Just a figure, standing still in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe another hiker or a local. But as we got closer, I realized something was off. He hadn't moved, not an inch. Just stood there like a statue watching the trail. Luke slowed his pace beside me, his brow furrowed. "You see that?" "Yeah," I muttered, shading my eyes with my hand. The sun was brutal, the dry heat shimmering off the ground, making it hard to see clearly. "He hasn't moved in a while." Luke glanced at me, his jaw tightening. "We should have caught up to him by now. He's not that far ahead." I didn't say anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no way someone could stand in this heat for that long without moving, and why wasn't he walking? It's not like there was anywhere to go but forward, just a barren stretch of trail winding through the red rock canyons. "Maybe he's resting," Luke said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, maybe." We kept walking, our boots crunching over the dry ground, the sun beating down on our backs. My throat was dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down my neck, but I forced myself to focus. The man, if that's what he was still ahead, but he hadn't gotten any closer. It was like we were walking in place, the distance between us never changing. Finally, Luke stopped, planting his hands on his hips as he stared ahead. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "He's got to be screwing with us." I swallowed, my mouth dry. Or maybe he's lost. Then why isn't he moving? I didn't have an answer. The desert was eerily quiet around us. No wind, no birds, just the oppressive stillness of the midday heat. It felt like the whole world had been muted, the only sound our own labored breathing. "I don't like this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke didn't respond at first, just kept staring ahead at the unmoving figure. After a moment, he nodded. Yeah, me neither. We stood there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. I felt a creeping unease settle in my stomach, the kind that made you want to turn around and get the hell out of there. But we were miles from the trailhead, and heading back wasn't an option, not without water or shade. I think we should keep going, Luke said finally, though his voice was tight. Maybe he's just some weirdo. Once we get close enough, he'll move on. I wasn't so sure, but standing there in the sun, sweating and staring at the distant figure, I couldn't think of a better plan, so we kept walking. The closer we got, the worse the feeling got. My heart was pounding now, not from the exertion but from something else, something primal. I couldn't explain it, but every step toward that figure felt wrong, like we were walking straight into danger. And then, without warning, the figure moved. He didn't turn around or walk away. He simply stepped to the side, disappearing behind a large rock formation as if he'd been waiting for us to get close enough. Luke stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you see that?" "Yeah," I breathed, my pulse racing. "He's hiding." "Why the hell would he be hiding?" Luke asked, his voice tight with frustration. "This trail's the only way out. Where's he going?" I didn't know. But something about the way he'd moved, so deliberate, so precise, sent a chill down my spine. "We should turn back," I said, my voice barely audible over the thudding of my heartbeat. "Something's not right." Luke hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the rock formation where the figure had disappeared. "We can't just—" Then we heard it, a low, muffled sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. It was coming from behind the rocks, faint but unmistakable. Luke's eyes widened, and he instinctively reached for the small hunting knife strapped to his pack. "What the hell is that?" I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "I don't know." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The muttering continued, a strange, rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't English, at least not any English I'd ever heard. It was guttural, almost like chanting. "Luke," I whispered, taking a step back, "we need to go." He didn't argue this time. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." We turned and started back the way we came, walking fast but not running. Running would have felt too desperate, too obvious. But every step we took, I could feel eyes on us. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on the back of my neck. I fought the urge to look over my shoulder, to see if he was following us, but I couldn't. I didn't want to see him again. "Don't look back," Luke said under his breath, his voice tense. "I'm not," I muttered, though the urge was almost unbearable. The muttering had stopped, but the oppressive silence had returned, thicker than before. The desert felt wrong now, like it was closing in on us. The endless expanse of red rock and sand that had once felt freeing now felt like a trap. We walked for what felt like hours, but the trailhead never seemed to get any closer. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows over the ground, and my legs ached from the constant strain. And then Luke stopped. I almost walked into him, barely catching myself before I stumbled. "What the hell, man?" I hissed. He didn't respond. He was staring ahead, his face pale, eyes wide. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was the same figure. The man, if you could even call him that, was back, but now he was closer, much closer. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he was waiting for us. But how? We'd been walking away from him for miles. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of us. No way. "Jesus Christ," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "How the hell—" I didn't have an answer. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the straps of my pack. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. "Luke, we need to go," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure. "Yeah, now." We didn't waste any more time. We turned and ran, our boots pounding against the dry ground, the hot air burning in our lungs. I didn't care about water, about the heat, about anything except getting away from that thing. We ran until my legs screamed in protest, until my breath came in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The only thought in my mind was to get as far away from that figure as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the parking lot. Our truck was there, the only vehicle in sight, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We didn't speak as we jumped in, slamming the doors behind us. Luke fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and the engine roared to life. We peeled out of the lot, kicking up dust behind us as we sped down the road. It wasn't until we were miles away, the sun setting behind us, that Luke finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't think I ever would. But one thing was for sure. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and it had been waiting for us. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching. Story 14. The first rays of sunlight hadn't even touched the mountain peaks when I heard it. A low, guttural breathing just outside my tent. In that moment, as fear paralyzed every muscle in my body, I realized that in my quest to capture the perfect sunrise, I might have stumbled into something far more dangerous than I ever imagined. My name is Mei Chen, and I'm a nature photographer. For years, I've traveled the world, seeking out the most remote and beautiful landscapes to capture through my lens. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what awaited me in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine trip. 3 days hiking into the backcountry, camping alone to get the shots no one else was willing to work for. I'd done it countless times before, in locations far more challenging than this. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to that heavy breathing and the sound of something massive circling my tent, I knew this time was different. The day had started normally enough. I'd set out at dawn, my backpack loaded with camera gear and enough supplies to last me the trip. The trail was challenging, winding its way up through dense forest and along steep ridgelines. But the views were worth it. Pristine wilderness, stretching as far as the eye could see, untouched by human hands. As the day wore on, I noticed something odd. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I shrugged it off, focusing on finding the perfect spot to set up camp for my sunrise shoot. I found it just before dusk, a small clearing on a ridgeline, offering an unobstructed view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. It was perfect. I set up my tent, prepared a small meal, and settled in for the night, setting my alarm for an hour before sunrise. That's when things started to go wrong. The sound woke me long before my alarm had a chance to go off. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was the wind. But as I became more alert, I realized it was something else entirely, something alive, something big. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds continued outside my tent. Heavy footsteps circled my campsite, accompanied by that deep, rhythmic breathing. Occasionally I heard snuffling, as if something was scenting the air. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion. But this sounded bigger than either of those, and the way it moved. There was an intelligence to it that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could see a massive shadow silhouetted against the thin fabric looming over me. My heart pounded so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. Then, to my horror, I saw a hand, if you could call it that, press against the side of the tent. It was huge, with long fingers ending in sharp claws. The fabric dented inward under its weight, and I had to stifle a scream. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the creature stood there. I didn't move, didn't breathe, silently praying for it to leave. Finally, with a low grunt, it moved away. I heard its footsteps recede into the forest, but I didn't dare relax. Something told me it wasn't gone for good. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate my tent, I knew I had to make a decision. My original plan, to capture the sunrise, seemed laughably unimportant now. I needed to get out of here, back to civilization, as fast as possible. Moving as quietly as I could, I packed up my gear. Every rustle of my sleeping bag, every zip of my backpack, sounded deafening in the early morning stillness. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps returning, to see that massive shadow fall over my tent again. Finally, I was ready. Taking a deep breath, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The clearing was empty, bathed in the soft light of dawn, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. The tracks. Huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, with long claw marks at the end of each toe. They circled my campsite before leading off into the forest. My blood ran cold as I realized the tracks weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. Not bear, not mountain lion. They looked almost human. But that was impossible, wasn't it? I didn't have time to ponder it further. I needed to get out of there. Slinging my backpack over my shoulders, I set off down the trail at a brisk pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, and with each step I felt like I was being followed, watched, hunted. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching on the gravel path. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl from somewhere behind me. I froze, slowly turning around. There, at the edge of the clearing I'd just left, stood something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Long arms hung nearly to the ground, ending in those massive, clawed hands I'd seen pressed against my tent. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a bizarre blend of ape and man, with eyes that burned with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a long moment we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it let out a roar that shook the trees and charged. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing down the trail with no regard for safety. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sound of pursuit was right behind me, an unstoppable force of nature bearing down with terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but still I pushed on. The creature's roars grew closer, then farther, then closer again, as if it was toying with me. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and saw something that made my heart leap, a park ranger station. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted for the building, practically falling through the door. The rangers inside looked up in shock as I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. There's something out there," I managed to choke out. "Something big. It chased me." They exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. "Ma'am, there are bears in these woods," one of them said gently. "Maybe that's what you saw." I shook my head vehemently. No, it wasn't a bear. I don't know what it was. But it was walking on two legs, it had hands, and its face—" I trailed off, realizing how insane I must sound. The rangers were looking at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Why don't you sit down?" the other ranger said, guiding me to a chair. "We'll send out a patrol to check the area. In the meantime, why don't you tell us exactly what happened?" So I did. I told them everything, from the strange silence in the forest, to the creature outside my tent, to the terrifying chase through the woods. As I spoke, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. How could they? If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rangers found no sign of the creature, no tracks matching what I'd described. My photographs from before the encounter showed nothing unusual. I was left with nothing but my memories and a deep, pervasive fear of the wilderness I'd once loved. I've been back home for weeks now, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of heavy breathing outside my window, and when I look out, I swear I can see eyes glinting in the darkness, intelligent, curious, and unmistakably inhuman. I don't know what I encountered out there in those woods. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it, but one thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every shadow could hide a secret. Every unexplained sound could be a warning, and those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, they'll haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Story 15. The moment I saw the image on my camera trap, I knew my life would never be the same. There, in the grainy night vision photo, stood a creature that defied explanation. Half man, half beast, its eyes glowed with an eerie intelligence that sent chills down my spine. My name is Omar Khalid, and I'm a wildlife photographer specializing in capturing images of elusive creatures. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. It started as a routine expedition. I'd been commissioned by a nature magazine to document the local wildlife, with a particular focus on the region's wolf population. The dense, misty forests of the area were perfect habitat for all sorts of animals, and I was excited to see what I might capture on film. I'd set up several camera traps along known game trails, hoping to catch glimpses of wolves, bears, and other shy forest dwellers. It was a technique I'd used countless times before, yielding some of my best shots. As I hiked back to my campsite on the third day of the expedition, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Get a grip, Omar," I muttered to myself. "You're letting the isolation get to you." But the feeling persisted as I made my way back to camp. That night, as I huddled in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest, every snapping twig and rustling leaf seemed magnified. The next morning, I set out to check my camera traps, eager to see what I'd captured. The first few yielded the usual assortment of deer, raccoons, and even a beautiful shot of a mountain lion. But when I reached the last camera, my heart nearly stopped. The device had been torn from its mounting, the sturdy metal casing bent and scratched as if by powerful claws. I found it lying in the underbrush several yards away, miraculously still intact. With trembling hands, I removed the memory card and slotted it into my laptop. Most of the images were corrupted, but a few had survived, and that's when I saw it. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a bizarre blend of human and canine features. Thick, dark fur covered most of its frame, but its face was disturbingly human-like, with intelligent eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera lens. "What the hell?" I whispered, zooming in on the image. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not a bear, not a wolf, and certainly not human. I scrolled through the remaining images, my heart racing. There were a few more blurry shots of the creature, including one that seemed to show it in the process of destroying the camera. As I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a twig snapped loudly behind me. I whirled around, nearly dropping my laptop. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure that matched the one in my photos. It was even more terrifying in person, its massive form radiating raw power and predatory intent. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the mist of it in the cool air. The creature's eyes, disturbingly human, seemed to bore into me with unnerving intelligence. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and bounded into the forest. "Wait!" I called out, surprising myself. But it was already gone, leaving behind only a set of enormous barefoot-like prints in the soft earth. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Was this the legendary Bigfoot, or something else entirely? I crouched down to examine the prints, my photographer's instinct kicking in despite my shock. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. As I studied the tracks, I noticed something else. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the underbrush nearby. With shaking hands, I carefully collected a sample, placing it in a small plastic bag. "This is insane," I muttered to myself. "Absolutely insane." But I knew what I'd seen, and now I had proof, the photos, the tracks, and the hair sample. The question was, what was I going to do with this information? Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, to pretend I'd never seen the creature. But my curiosity and professional pride wouldn't let me walk away from the story of a lifetime. I spent the rest of the day setting up more camera traps, this time with sturdier mountings and camouflaged casings. If that creature was still in the area, I was determined to get clearer footage. As night fell, I returned to my campsite, every sense on high alert. The forest seemed different now, charged with an energy I'd never noticed before. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every sound a possible threat. I barely slept that night, starting at every noise outside my tent. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but wired with nervous energy. I spent the morning reviewing my photos and notes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The creature's appearance defied easy categorization. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, but some impossible combination of the two. As I pored over the images, a realization struck me. The way the creature moved, the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. Whatever it was self-aware, and that made it infinitely more fascinating and dangerous. Around midday, I set out to check my new camera traps, hoping against hope that I'd captured more footage. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet as I made my way along the game trail, the usual bird song and animal noises conspicuously absent. I was about halfway to the first camera when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the oppressive silence. "Is someone there?" The only response was another growl, closer this time. I slowly turned in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. The creature stood no more than 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive old-growth tree. Its eyes, gleaming with that unsettling intelligence, were fixed directly on me. "Easy," I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it understood my words. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped out from behind the tree. In the clear light of day, I could see it in all its impossible detail. The blend of human and animal features was even more pronounced up close, the muscular, fur-covered body contrasting with the disturbingly human-like face and hands. I reached slowly for my camera, not daring to take my eyes off the creature. "I just want to understand," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "What are you?" The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl or a grimace, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It took a step towards me, its massive frame towering over mine. I raised my camera, more out of reflex than any real plan. The click of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. The flash went off, momentarily illuminating the clearing. The creature roared, A sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground. Before I could react, it lunged forward with shocking speed. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush. The creature's thunderous footsteps closed behind. I burst into a small clearing, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Up ahead, I could see my campsite. If I could just reach my truck. A heavy weight slammed into my back, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the air driven from my lungs. As I rolled onto my back, I found myself face to face with the creature. Its hot breath washed over me as it leaned in close, those intelligent eyes boring into mine. I was certain this was the end, but instead of attacking, it simply sniffed me. Its nostrils flared as it took in my scent, a look of what might have been curiosity crossing its strange features. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. With one powerful leap, it bounded back into the forest, leaving me lying there in shocked disbelief. I don't know how long I stayed there, my heart racing and mind reeling. When I finally managed to push myself to my feet, my legs were shaky and weak. I stumbled back to my campsite, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and excitement. What I'd encountered defied explanation, but one thing was certain: I couldn't walk away from this. As I began packing up my gear, my resolve hardened. I would stay, gather more evidence, and uncover the truth behind this incredible creature. Whatever it took, I was determined to solve the mystery of what lurked in these woods. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of an adventure that would change my life forever. Story 16. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, a kind of chill that made the world feel smaller, quieter. I'd been on plenty of winter expeditions, but this one felt different from the start, like the wilderness itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just the cold that was unnerving, it was the silence, the kind that presses in on you, thick and suffocating, like something is waiting just beyond the edge of the trees. The wind cut through my jacket as I stood outside the cabin, watching the sun sink below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered forest. My breath hung in the air, each exhale coming in quick, nervous puffs. Something was wrong. We'd been up here for 2 days, and every night since we arrived, I'd had that gnawing feeling in my gut, the one that said we weren't alone. It wasn't just the cold. I could deal with that. It was the silence, the kind that made you feel like the world had stopped spinning. No animals, no birds, no wind through the trees, just the sound of our own movements breaking the stillness. "Everything all right out there?" I turned to see Kyle, my hiking partner, standing in the doorway of the cabin, his brow furrowed with concern, his breath clouded in the cold as he pulled his hat lower over his ears, stepping out into the snow. "Yeah," I lied, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, just soaking in the quiet. Kyle shot me a skeptical look. He knew me too well. "You've been jumpy since we got here. What's going on?" I glanced back at the tree line, the thick pines standing like sentinels against the darkening sky. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "It's just too quiet, you know? There's no wildlife, no birds, no deer, nothing." Kyle shrugged. "We're deep in the mountains. Maybe they all moved lower for the winter." "Maybe," I muttered, but I didn't believe it. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, forcing a smile. "Look, man, we're fine. It's just us out here. No one's dumb enough to be out in this kind of cold except us. Let's head inside and get the fire going." I nodded, but as I followed him back into the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. We'd come out here to the far reaches of northern Canada for a winter expedition. Kyle and I were both experienced outdoorsmen, always up for a challenge, and this remote cabin deep in the wilderness had seemed like the perfect escape. A few days of isolation, some fresh air, and a chance to get away from it all. But now I was starting to regret it. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, but even its warmth didn't seem to touch the cold that clung to me. I sat down at the small wooden table, watching Kyle as he set up the camp stove to boil water for dinner. "You're sure it's just us out here, right?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Kyle didn't look up. "You're not seriously still worried about that, are you?" I hesitated. "I don't know, man. I've just got this weird feeling, like we're being watched." He glanced up at me, the flicker of amusement gone from his eyes. "Look, I get it. The isolation messes with your head sometimes, but I checked the map before we left. The nearest cabin is miles away, and the closest town, even farther. We're the only people dumb enough to be up here." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as the wind picked up outside, howling through the cracks in the cabin's walls, that feeling of unease settled deeper into my bones. "Maybe I'm just tired," I muttered, rubbing my hands together for warmth. Kyle nodded, his expression softening. "We'll get some sleep after dinner. Tomorrow, we'll head out on the trail and check out the valley. That'll get your mind off things." Dinner was quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of the stove as the water boiled. I could see the snow piling up against the windows, the world outside growing darker with every passing minute. By the time we finished eating, the wind had become a constant roar, shaking the cabin. Kyle yawned and stretched, standing up from the table. "All right, I'm hitting the sack. Early start tomorrow." I nodded, still feeling uneasy, but I didn't argue. We'd had a long day, and sleep would at least give me a few hours of escape from the gnawing feeling in my gut. "Night," I muttered, as I crawled into my sleeping bag on the floor, the fire casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Kyle grunted in response, already half asleep in his cot across the room. But I couldn't sleep. The wind outside felt different. It wasn't just a storm. There was something in the way it howled, something almost human in the sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the thoughts away, but they kept coming. I listened to the wind, and it started to feel like more than just weather. It was like a voice, no voices, whispering just outside, just beyond the door. At first it was faint. I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. My name. "David!" I shot up, heart racing, eyes wide as I stared at the door. The voice was low, raspy, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Someone had said my name, not just someone. It was my brother's voice, but that was impossible. "David! Come outside!" My chest tightened, panic rising as I tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. My brother had been dead for 3 years. There was no way it was him. But the voice was so familiar, so real. "David, help me." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my breathing quick and shallow. "Kyle," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Kyle, wake up." He groaned, half asleep, but I kept shaking him until his eyes blinked open. "What the hell, man?" "I heard something," I whispered, glancing at the door. "Outside. Someone's out there." Kyle sat up, rubbing his face. "What are you talking about?" "It's my brother," I said, my voice shaking. "I heard his voice." Kyle stared at me, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Your brother's dead, David. You know that." "I know," I whispered, running a hand through my hair. "But I heard him. I swear to God I heard him calling my name." Kyle frowned, glancing toward the door. "It's probably just the wind messing with your head." "It wasn't the wind," I insisted, my pulse racing. "It was him. I know his voice." Kyle sighed, swinging his legs off the cot. "All right, let's check it out. But I'm telling you, man, there's no one out there." I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I followed him to the door. The wind howled outside, louder now, rattling the windows. I could still hear the voice, faint but persistent, calling my name. Kyle threw open the door, and the freezing air blasted into the cabin, making me gasp. We stepped out into the snow, the wind biting at my face as I shone the flashlight across the landscape. Nothing. The snow was untouched, the trees swaying in the wind, but there was no one there. No footprints, no sign of movement. Just the endless stretch of white. Kyle turned to me, his expression grim. "See? Nothing." But I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, and then I saw it, just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the swirling snow. A figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, was watching us. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its limbs were long and twisted, like something not quite human. "Holy shit," I whispered, backing up toward the cabin. "Kyle, do you see that?" Kyle followed my gaze, and his face went pale. "What the—" The figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its body moving in jerky, unnatural motions as it came closer, its glowing eyes fixed on us. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stumbled back into the cabin. "Get inside!" I shouted, slamming the door shut behind us. Kyle bolted the door, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, my back pressed against the door, my heart racing. The wind outside howled louder, the cabin creaking under the force of the storm, and through the wind I heard it again, my brother's voice, faint but insistent. "David, let me in." We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, huddled in silence, listening to the wind howl outside, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning the storm had passed, but the fear lingered. Whatever was out there, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Story 17. The moment I saw the mutilated carcass, I knew this was no ordinary kill. The deer's body was torn apart with a savagery that went beyond any predator I'd encountered in my 20 years as a hunter. But it was the footprints around the kill site that truly chilled my blood, huge, bipedal tracks that belonged to no animal I could name. In that instant, I realized I wasn't the apex predator in these woods anymore. Something else was hunting here, something that defied explanation. My name is Klaus Berger, and I've been a hunter all my life. Growing up in the Black Forest of Germany, I learned to track and hunt from my father and grandfather. When I moved to America 10 years ago, I brought those skills with me, quickly establishing myself as one of the top guides in the Pacific Northwest. This particular hunting trip started like any other. My client, a wealthy businessman named Richard, had hired me for a week-long expedition deep into the wilderness. He was after a trophy buck, and I was confident I could deliver. We set out at dawn, the crisp autumn air filled with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. My hunting dog, Max, trotted ahead, nose to the ground. Everything seemed normal, but as we ventured deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The woods were too quiet, no birdsong, no chattering squirrels. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. "Is it always this quiet out here?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, frowning. No, something's not right. We pressed on, following a game trail that I knew led to a clearing where deer often grazed. That's when we found the carcass. The smell hit us first, the coppery tang of blood mixed with the sickly sweet odor of decay. As we entered the clearing, I saw Max freeze, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Jesus Christ," Richard muttered, his face pale as he took in the grisly scene. The deer lay in the center of the clearing, or what was left of it. Its body had been ripped open, organs strewn about as if something had been rooting through its innards. But it was the precision of the kill that disturbed me most. The throat had been torn out with surgical accuracy, and the legs were broken in exactly the right places to immobilize the animal. This wasn't the work of a bear or mountain lion. This was something else entirely. "We should go," Richard said, tugging at my sleeve. "Whatever did this might still be around." I nodded, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene. That's when I noticed the tracks. They circled the carcass, huge prints pressed deep into the soft earth. At first glance, they looked almost human, but much larger, easily twice the size of my own foot, and at the end of each toe I could see the imprint of a vicious claw. "Klaus!" Richard's voice was edged with panic now. "What are those?" I shook my head, unable to form words. In all my years of hunting, I'd never seen anything like this. Suddenly, Max let out a series of sharp barks, staring intently at the tree line. I followed his gaze, my hand instinctively tightening on my rifle. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved. Something large, much larger than a man, stepped partially out from behind a massive pine. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long arms that nearly touched the ground, and then I saw its eyes, intelligent, predatory, and fixed directly on us. "Run!" I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "Run!" We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. Behind us, I heard a roar that shook the very air, followed by the sound of something massive giving chase. My heart pounded in my chest as we ran, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Richard was just ahead of me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Max bounded alongside, barking frantically. The creature was gaining on us. I could hear its heavy footfalls, the crack of branches as it ploughed through the forest with terrifying speed. "There!" Richard shouted, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could see the outline of an old hunter's cabin. It wasn't much, but it was our only hope. We burst into the small clearing, sprinting for the cabin door. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the mechanism. Behind us, the roars grew closer. Finally, the door swung open. We tumbled inside, slamming it shut just as something massive collided with the outer wall. The entire cabin shook with the impact. For several long moments, we stood there, gasping for breath, listening to the creature outside. It circled the cabin, testing the walls, the windows. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its wild, musky scent. "What is that thing?" Richard whispered, his face ashen. I shook my head, unable to provide an answer. My mind raced through possibilities, bears, mountain lions, but I knew deep down that this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As night fell, the attacks intensified. The creature threw itself against the walls, the door, trying to find a way in. Each impact made the cabin shudder, and I feared it was only a matter of time before the old structure gave way. We took turns keeping watch, our weapons trained on the door. Max huddled in the corner, whimpering softly. The hours crawled by, each moment stretched taut with terror. Just before dawn, the attacks suddenly ceased. The forest fell silent once more. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, but the creature didn't return. As the first light of day filtered through the cabin's grimy windows, we cautiously emerged. The clearing was empty, but the signs of the night's terror were everywhere. Deep claw marks scored the cabin walls, and those massive footprints circled the building. "We need to get out of here," Richard said, his voice shaky. "Call for help." I nodded, pulling out my satellite phone. But as I dialed, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over, that whatever had attacked us was still out there, watching, waiting. The rescue team arrived a few hours later, skeptical of our story, but unsettled by the physical evidence. As we were airlifted out, I looked down at the vast expanse of forest below. Somewhere down there, hidden in those woods, was a creature that defied explanation, a predator that had turned the hunters into the hunted. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I pored over books on cryptozoology, spoke to local experts about legends of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but nothing quite matched what we had encountered. I haven't been back to those woods since that day. My clients now request other hunting grounds, and I'm more than happy to oblige. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of heavy breathing outside my window, and when I look out, I swear I can see eyes glinting in the darkness, intelligent, predatory, and unmistakably inhuman. I don't know what we encountered out there in the wilderness. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. But one thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. Every shadow could hide a secret. Every unexplained sound could be a warning. And those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, they'll haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, because now I know the truth. In the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, we are not the hunters. We are the prey. Story 18. The eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my headlamp. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and the intelligence behind them sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. I was no longer alone on this trail. My name is Lena Kowalski, and I'm an experienced night hiker. Or at least, I thought I was until that moment. The Carpathian Mountains had always been my playground, their dense forests and rugged terrain a welcome challenge. But nothing in my years of nocturnal adventures could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. The day had started normally enough. I'd arrived at the trailhead just before sunset, my backpack loaded with gear for an overnight trek. The plan was to hike through the night, reaching a remote campsite by dawn. It was a route I'd done before, though never alone. As darkness fell, I switched on my headlamp and set out. The forest came alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The familiar noises were comforting, a reminder that I was just another part of this nocturnal world. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made good time, the rhythm of my footsteps and the swing of my trekking poles almost meditative. The cool night air filled my lungs, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime chorus silenced. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I paused, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond my own breathing. "Get it together, Lena," I muttered to myself, shaking off the growing unease. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I pressed on, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every rustle in the underbrush a cause for alarm. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the relative safety of my planned campsite. That's when I saw them, the eyes gleaming in the darkness just beyond the reach of my headlamp. They were easily 7 feet off the ground, far too high for any normal forest dweller. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the oppressive silence. "Is someone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I saw the eyes blink. Slowly, I reached for the bear spray on my belt, never taking my eyes off the gleaming orbs in the darkness. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just passing through." A low, rumbling growl answered me, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite animal, but certainly not human. The sound sent ice through my veins. That's when I ran. I tore down the trail, branches whipping at my face as I sprinted through the darkness. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, legs pumping furiously. Up ahead, I could see a break in the trees, a small clearing where I'd planned to make camp. If I could just reach my trailer. I burst into the clearing, relief flooding through me as I spotted my small camper parked at the edge. But as I fumbled for my keys, a movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a figure that defied explanation. In the dim light of my headlamp, I could make out a massive, fur-covered body easily 8 feet tall. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with those same gleaming eyes that had watched me from the darkness. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it charged. I dove into my trailer, slamming the door shut just as a heavy weight crashed against it. The entire vehicle rocked with the impact, and I could hear claws scraping against the metal exterior. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Leave me alone!" The only response was another bone-shaking impact against the side of the trailer. I scrambled to lock every window and door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the latches. For what felt like hours, the creature circled my trailer, occasionally throwing its weight against the walls or roof. I huddled in the center of the small space, clutching my bear spray and trying to control my panicked breathing. Eventually, the sounds outside began to fade. The impact stopped, and I could hear heavy footsteps moving away from the trailer. But I didn't dare move, too afraid that it might be a trick. I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake to the sound of birdsong. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, and for a moment I wondered if it had all been a terrible nightmare. But as I cautiously peered out the window, my blood ran cold. The clearing around my trailer was a mess of huge, barefoot-like prints pressed deep into the mud, and there, scored into the metal siding of my camper, were deep claw marks that no bear could have made. With shaking hands, I opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the terror of the night before. I circled my trailer, cataloguing the damage with a mixture of fear and disbelief. That's when I noticed something caught on a nearby branch, a tuft of coarse, dark hair, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I carefully collected it, placing it in a small plastic bag from my pack. As I stood there, holding physical proof of my encounter, I was faced with a choice. I could pack up and leave, try to forget what had happened and never return to these woods, or I could stay, gather more evidence, and try to uncover the truth behind what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But there was another part, the part that had always driven me to explore, to seek out the unknown, that wouldn't let me walk away. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. "Okay," I said aloud, as if to convince myself. "One more night. If nothing happens, I'll chalk it up to an overly vivid imagination and too many campfire stories." I spent the day reinforcing my trailer, using what tools and materials I had to secure the windows and doors. As dusk approached, I set up a series of motion-activated cameras around the clearing. If that thing came back, I was determined to get proof. As night fell, I settled into my trailer, every sense on high alert. Hours passed with nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. I was just starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching from the forest. My heart raced as I peered out the window. There, illuminated by the motion-activated lights, stood the creature. It was even more terrifying in clear view, its massive form radiating raw power and predatory intent. It circled the trailer slowly, those intelligent eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle. I held my breath, praying the reinforcements would hold. Suddenly, it stopped and looked directly at the window where I was watching. A chill ran down my spine as our eyes met. There was an awareness there, a sentience that defied explanation. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, to my utter shock, it raised a hand that was disturbingly human-like despite its massive size and clawed fingers, and pressed it against the window. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I found myself raising my own hand to mirror the gesture. As our palms met, separated only by the thin pane of glass, I felt a connection I couldn't explain. The creature's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I saw something there beyond the animal savagery. Curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of recognition. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. With one powerful leap, it bounded back into the forest, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. As I sat there, my hand still pressed against the cool glass, I knew my life had changed irrevocably. Whatever that creature was, whatever was happening in these mountains, I was now a part of it. And somehow I knew this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery, one I was determined to solve, no matter the cost. Story 19. The moment I saw those strange symbols carved into the cabin walls, I knew our simple hiking trip had taken a dark turn. But it wasn't until nightfall, when the children started screaming about glowing eyes in the darkness, that I realized we had stumbled into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. My name is Annika Larson, and I've been a scout leader for over a decade. I've led countless expeditions into the wilderness, teaching kids about nature, survival skills, and the importance of teamwork. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what we encountered in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day hike, challenging enough to be exciting for the kids, but well within our capabilities. Our group consisted of myself, my assistant leader Mike, and 8 children between the ages of 12 and 14. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the excited chatter of the kids. The first day went smoothly. We hiked about 10 miles, stopping frequently to identify plants, observe wildlife, and practice basic orienteering skills. As evening approached, we began looking for a suitable campsite. That's when Zach, one of our more adventurous scouts, called out from up ahead, "Ms. Larson, I found a cabin." I frowned, consulting my map. There shouldn't have been any structures in this area. "Stay where you are, Zach. I'm coming to check it out." As I approached, I saw it. An old, weathered cabin nestled among the trees. It looked long abandoned, its wood grey with age and partially reclaimed by the forest. But it was the symbols carved into its walls that made me pause. Strange, angular shapes that didn't resemble any language or writing system I recognized. "Cool," Zach exclaimed, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. I caught his hand, a sudden sense of unease washing over me. "Don't touch anything," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We don't know who this belongs to." Mike joined us, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene. "Annika, we should move on, find somewhere else to camp." I nodded, but a quick glance at the sky changed my mind. Dark clouds were rolling in, and I could smell rain on the wind. "No time," I said. "Storm's coming. We'll have to use the cabin for shelter." The inside of the cabin was sparse, a single room with a rusty pot-bellied stove, a few broken chairs, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But it was dry and would keep us out of the rain. As the kids set up their sleeping bags, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The symbols on the walls seemed to watch us, their angular shapes throwing strange shadows in the fading light. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a storm that shook the old cabin. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled through the cracks in the walls. I tried to keep the kids' spirits up with stories and games, but I could see the fear in their eyes. It was just after midnight when it happened. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, and for a split second I saw something outside the window, a tall, dark shape that couldn't have been human. Before I could process what I'd seen, Emily, our youngest scout, let out a terrified scream. "There's something out there," she cried, pointing at the window. "I saw eyes." The cabin erupted into chaos. Kids scrambled for their flashlights, beams of light dancing wildly across the walls and windows. "Everyone calm down," I shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. "It was probably just an animal. We're safe in here." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true, because I had seen it too. A pair of eyes glowing in the darkness, too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest creature. Mike met my gaze across the room, his face pale. "Annika," he said quietly, "what do we do?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think rationally. "We stick together," I said. "No one goes outside, no matter what. We wait for morning." The next few hours were the longest of my life. The storm raged on, but now we could hear other sounds beneath the wind and rain. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, deep, guttural breathing, and occasionally a low growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The kids huddled together in the center of the room, their sleeping bags forming a protective circle. I moved between them, offering what comfort I could, all while straining my ears for any sign that our unseen watcher was trying to get in. As dawn approached, the sounds outside gradually faded. The storm passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. "Okay, everyone," I said, forcing a cheerfulness I didn't feel into my voice. "Let's pack up and get moving. We've got a long hike ahead of us." But as we stepped outside the cabin, my forced optimism evaporated. The clearing around the cabin was a mess of huge, misshapen footprints, far too large to belong to any animal I knew. And there, carved freshly into the trunk of a massive pine, were the same strange symbols we'd seen on the cabin walls. Mike came to stand beside me, his face grim. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly. "Now." I nodded, unable to find words. As we hurried the kids into hiking formation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had stalked us during the night was still out there, following us. Our return hike was a tense, hurried affair. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. The kids, picking up on our fear, were unnaturally quiet. Even Zach, usually the first to run ahead, stayed close to the group. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead, the parking lot, and my battered old van in sight, that I allowed myself to believe we might make it out okay. But as the kids piled into the vehicle, chattering with relief, I took one last look at the forest. There, just inside the tree line, I saw it. A tall, dark figure, partially hidden behind a massive pine. As I watched, frozen in fear, it raised a hand far too large, with fingers that ended in wicked claws. It wasn't a wave, it wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement, a promise. This wasn't over. The drive back to town was a blur. The parents, waiting anxiously in the Scout Hall parking lot, knew something was wrong the moment they saw our faces. I gave them a sanitized version of events, bad storm, spooked by wildlife, but I could see they didn't fully believe me. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched local legends, spoke to forest rangers and long-time residents, but no one could explain what we had encountered. The symbols remained a mystery, their meaning lost to time. I haven't led another expedition since that day. The other scouts talk about the night in the cabin sometimes, their stories growing more elaborate with each retelling. But I stay quiet, because I know the truth is far more terrifying than any story they could invent. Sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of heavy breathing outside my window, and when I look out, I swear I can see eyes glinting in the darkness, intelligent, curious, and unmistakably inhuman. I don't know what we encountered out there in those woods. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it, but one thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every shadow could hide a secret, every unexplained sound could be a warning. And those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, they'll haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, because now I know the truth. In the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, there are things that defy explanation, things that watch and wait and remember, and someday I fear they might come looking for us again. Story 20. The deer carcass lay before me, a grotesque tableau that defied natural explanation. Its ribcage had been wrenched open with impossible force, organs missing, but it wasn't the gore that chilled me to the bone. It was the precision of the mutilation, the almost surgical nature of the wounds. Whatever had done this was no ordinary predator. My name is Dr. Raj Patel, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators. I thought I'd seen it all in my years of fieldwork, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. It started as a routine research expedition. I'd been tracking wolf populations in the area, studying their hunting patterns and territory disputes. The dense, misty forests were perfect wolf habitat, teeming with prey and largely untouched by human development. I'd set up camp near a small clearing, my tent and research equipment a tiny island of civilization in the vast wilderness. That morning I'd risen early, eager to check the trail cameras I'd set up along known game paths. The first few cameras yielded the usual assortment of deer, elk, and the occasional black bear. But as I approached the final camera location, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. An acrid, musky odor hung in the air, unlike anything I'd encountered before. That's when I saw it, the mutilated deer carcass, sprawled in a small clearing just off the main trail. I approached cautiously, my scientific curiosity warring with a primal instinct to flee. "What the hell did this?" I muttered, crouching down to examine the carcass more closely. The wounds were like nothing I'd ever seen. No wolf pack could have done this, nor any bear or mountain lion. The rib cage had been split open with surgical precision, yet the surrounding muscle tissue was torn and shredded as if by enormous claws. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves and began to document the scene, taking photos and samples for later analysis. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold some lurking threat. That's when I noticed the tracks. Enormous, barefoot-like prints pressed deep into the soft earth around the carcass. They were easily twice the size of my own boots, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. "Impossible," I breathed, measuring the prints with shaking hands. Nothing in the local ecosystem could have left tracks like these. Nothing that I knew of, anyway. I was so engrossed in my examination that I almost missed the sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I raised my head, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. A pair of eyes gleaming in the shadows, set far too high off the ground to belong to any known predator. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the oppressive silence. "Is someone there?" The only response was another growl, closer this time. I slowly stood, my hands raised in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Easy now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just a researcher." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a speed that defied its size, a massive form burst from the underbrush. My scientific mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The creature stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a bizarre blend of human and animal features. Thick, dark fur covered most of its frame, but its face was disturbingly human-like, with intelligent eyes that seemed to bore into me. "Oh my God," I whispered, stumbling backward. "You're real. You're actually real." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it understood my words. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped towards me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground. This was the discovery of a lifetime, and I wasn't about to let fear rob me of the chance to document it. With trembling hands, I raised my camera. "I just want to understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl or a grimace, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It took another step forward, its massive frame towering over mine. I managed to snap a few photos before the creature let out a roar so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground. Before I could react, it lunged forward with shocking speed. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, the creature's thunderous footsteps close behind. I burst into the clearing where I'd set up camp, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Without breaking stride, I dove into my tent, frantically zipping it closed behind me. I knew it was a flimsy barrier, but it was all I had. I could hear the creature circling outside, its heavy breathing and occasional grunts sending chills down my spine. "This isn't happening," I muttered to myself, fumbling for my satellite phone. "This can't be real." But I knew it was. The photos on my camera and the samples in my pack were proof of that. As I dialed for emergency services, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd seen. If this creature was real, it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about evolution and the natural world. "Emergency services. What's your situation?" a calm voice answered. "I need help," I gasped, trying to keep my voice down. "I'm in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. There's something out here. Something not natural." "Sir, can you be more specific? Are you in danger?" Before I could answer, a massive hand slammed against the side of the tent, the fabric straining under the impact. I bit back a scream, my whole body trembling. "Please," I whispered into the phone. "Please send help. I don't know how long I can—" The tent ripped open with a deafening tear, and I found myself face to face with the creature. Its hot breath washed over me as it leaned in close, those intelligent eyes boring into mine. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I was certain this was the end, but instead of attacking, it simply sniffed me. Its nostrils flared as it took in my scent, a look of what might have been curiosity crossing its strange features. Then, to my utter shock, it reached out and gently touched the camera still clutched in my hand. There was an unmistakable intelligence in its eyes, a sentience that defied explanation. You understand, don't you?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You know what this is." The creature made a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, but not quite speech either. It pointed at the camera, then at itself, then back at the camera. My scientific mind raced to interpret this behavior. Was it trying to communicate? Did it understand the concept of documentation? Before I could pursue that line of thought, the sound of distant helicopter rotors broke the silence. The creature's head snapped up, its eyes scanning the sky. With one last look at me, a look that seemed to hold a mixture of curiosity and warning, it turned and bounded into the forest with impossible speed. I sat there in my ruined tent, heart pounding, as the helicopter drew closer. Part of me was relieved at the prospect of rescue, but another part, wished I had more time to understand this incredible creature. As I gathered my equipment and samples, my resolve hardened. I couldn't walk away from this discovery, no matter the risk. Whatever that creature was, wherever it came from, I was determined to uncover the truth. Little did I know, this encounter was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and about myself. Story 21. The scream that echoed through the mountains that day wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, something that made my blood run cold and my rational mind struggle to make sense of what I'd heard. But it was what I found when I followed that sound that truly shook me to my core. My name is Raul Mendoza, and I'm a geologist specializing in volcanic activity. I've spent the last 15 years studying some of the most active and dangerous volcanoes around the world, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Range. It was supposed to be a routine survey. The USGS had picked up some unusual seismic activity in the area, and I was sent to collect samples and set up monitoring equipment. I'd been in the field for 3 days, working my way up the rugged slopes of an ancient, long-dormant volcano. The morning it happened started like any other. I woke at dawn, broke camp, and set out for my next collection site. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the distant smell of snow from the higher peaks. As I hiked, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest was too quiet, no birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie, watchful silence. I was about halfway to my destination when I heard it. A scream that started low and guttural before rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast wilderness. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No response. Just that unnatural silence again. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get out of there as fast as I could. But my scientific curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what had made that sound. I adjusted my pack and started moving in the direction I thought the scream had come from. The terrain became rougher, forcing me to scramble over boulders and push through dense underbrush. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin out, giving way to a rocky landscape dotted with scrub brush. That's when I smelled it. A sickly sweet odor that reminded me of rotting meat, but with an underlying musk that I couldn't identify. It grew stronger as I approached a small clearing ahead. I stepped into the open area and felt my heart stop. The clearing was littered with bones, dozens of them, scattered across the rocky ground. Some were clearly animal, deer, elk, maybe even bear, but others looked disturbingly human. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, my voice shaking. I knelt to examine one of the larger skulls, my geologist's instincts kicking in despite my fear. It was definitely human, but there was something off about it. The brow ridge was too pronounced, the jaw too heavy. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, easily 8 feet, covered in matted fur that might once have been reddish-brown, but was now stained dark with what looked horribly like dried blood. Its arms were long, almost reaching the ground, ending in hands tipped with vicious claws. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a bizarre blend of ape and man, with eyes that burned with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a long moment we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out that same bone-chilling scream I'd heard earlier. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing back through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sound of pursuit was right behind me, an unstoppable force of nature bearing down with terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but still I pushed on. The creature's roars grew closer, then farther, then closer again, as if it was toying with me. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and saw something that made my heart leap. My base camp. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted for my tent, practically diving inside. I fumbled for my satellite phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. "This is Raul Mendoza," I gasped as soon as the call connected. "I need immediate evacuation. There's something out here, something, I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous." "Calm down, Dr. Mendoza," the voice on the other end said. "What's your location?" I rattled off my coordinates, all the while straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. "Please," I added, my voice cracking, "please hurry." The wait for rescue was the longest 2 hours of my life. I sat in my tent, my geological hammer clutched in one hand, jumping at every sound. But the creature didn't return. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, I nearly wept with relief. The team that came to get me was skeptical of my story, of course. But they couldn't deny the state I was in. Clothes torn, covered in scratches, wild-eyed with fear. They did a cursory search of the area, but found nothing unusual. No bones, no tracks, no sign of the creature I'd seen. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I pored over books on cryptozoology, spoke to anthropologists about legends of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but nothing quite matched what I had encountered. The official report chalked it up to altitude sickness and an overactive imagination. My reputation took a hit, the rational geologist who lost his mind in the mountains. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. I haven't been back to those mountains since that day. My work now keeps me firmly in the lab, away from the field. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of that unearthly scream. And when I look out my window, I swear I can see eyes glinting in the darkness, intelligent, predatory, and unmistakably inhuman. I don't know what I encountered out there in the wilderness. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at the mountains the same way again. Every shadow could hide a secret. Every unexplained sound could be a warning. And those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, they'll haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Because now I know the truth. In the deepest, darkest parts of the world, there are things that defy scientific explanation. Things that challenge everything we think we know about evolution and human history. I went into those mountains as a scientist, confident in my understanding of the natural world. I came out a changed man, haunted by the knowledge that there are some mysteries that science may never be able to explain. And somewhere out there, in the remote wilderness, that creature is still roaming, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. Story 22. The scream tore through the night, a sound so primal and alien it made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, wasn't animal, it was something else entirely. As it echoed through the forest, I knew our camping trip had just taken a terrifying turn. My name is Mei Chen, and what was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with friends turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. We were deep in the heart of the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest town or cell signal. It was just the four of us. Me, my best friend Zoe, her boyfriend Jake, and our mutual friend Chris. The day had started normally enough. We'd hiked into our campsite, a small clearing near a babbling stream. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines as we set up our tents and gathered firewood. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wild herbs. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "Hey, did you guys hear about the weird sightings in this area?" Chris asked, his face eerily illuminated by the firelight. Zoe rolled her eyes. "Oh no, not another one of your cryptid stories." "I'm serious," Chris protested. "There have been reports of something big in these woods, something not quite human, not quite animal." Jake laughed, wrapping an arm around Zoe. "Come on, man. You don't actually believe in Bigfoot, do you?" I stayed quiet, watching the interplay. I'd always been fascinated by folklore and unexplained phenomena, but I tried to keep an open mind. "It's not just Bigfoot," Chris continued, leaning forward intently. "People have reported all sorts of weird creatures out here. Dogmen, skinwalkers, you name it." "All right, that's enough," Zoe said, standing up. "You're going to give us all nightmares. I'm turning in." As the others headed to their tents, I lingered by the fire, lost in thought. The forest seemed different now, charged with an energy I hadn't noticed before. Every shadow held the potential for mystery, every rustle in the underbrush a possible otherworldly visitor. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake to that bone-chilling scream. For a moment I thought I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, closer this time. "Did you guys hear that?" Zoe's voice called out, trembling slightly. "What the hell was that?" Jake responded, sounding shaken. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. The others were already gathered around the smouldering remains of our campfire, faces pale in the moonlight. "It's probably just a mountain lion," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. Chris shook his head. "No way, man. That was no cat." Before anyone could respond, another scream split the night. It was definitely closer now, and it was answered by another cry from the opposite direction. "We need to get out of here," Zoe said, her voice tight with fear. "The car's miles away," I reminded her. "We'd never make it in the dark." Jake nodded, taking charge. "Okay, let's not panic. We'll stoke up the fire and wait it out. Whatever it is, it probably won't come near the light." We set about gathering more firewood, none of us wanting to stray too far from the campsite. As I bent to pick up a fallen branch, movement caught my eye. I froze, heart in my throat. There, just at the edge of the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a body that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw gleaming eyes reflecting the firelight. Then it was gone. "Guys," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, "I saw something." The others gathered around me as I described what I'd seen. Chris's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, while Zoe looked like she was on the verge of tears. "We need to leave," she insisted. "Now." Jake shook his head. "It's too dangerous in the dark. We could get lost or fall and hurt ourselves. Our best bet is to wait for dawn." As if in response to our debate, another scream echoed through the forest. This time, it was answered by multiple cries, coming from all directions. We huddled close to the fire, weapons improvised from branches clutched in our hands. None of us slept that night, jumping at every sound and shadow. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. We'd made it through the night, but our relief was short-lived. "Oh my God!" Zoe gasped, pointing towards the edge of our campsite. Our tents were in tatters, ripped to shreds as if by massive claws. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, food containers torn open and their contents strewn about. "What could have done this?" Jake muttered, examining the destruction. That's when I saw them, footprints, massive and clearly not human, pressed deep into the soft earth around our campsite. "Guys," I called out, my voice shaking, "you need to see this." We gathered around the prints, a chill running down my spine as I realized they formed a complete circle around our campfire. Whatever had made them had been watching us all night. "We need to go," Chris said, his earlier excitement replaced by genuine fear. "Now." No one argued. We hastily gathered what supplies we could salvage and set off down the trail towards where we'd left the car. The forest felt different in the daylight, but no less menacing. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. We'd been hiking for about an hour when Zoe suddenly stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" We all froze, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing. Then, faintly but unmistakably, came the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, and they were getting closer. "Run!" Jake yelled, grabbing Zoe's hand. We took off down the trail, branches whipping at our faces as we sprinted through the forest. I could hear something crashing through the trees behind us, gaining ground with each passing second. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, legs pumping furiously. Up ahead, I could see a break in the trees, the parking area where we'd left the car. We burst out of the tree line, relief flooding through me as I spotted Jake's SUV. But as we reached the vehicle, my blood ran cold. All 4 tires had been slashed, deep gouges scored into the metal of the doors and hood. "No, no, no," Zoe sobbed, pulling frantically at the door handle. "We can't stay here," Chris said, glancing nervously at the forest. "We need to keep moving." Jake nodded grimly. "The ranger station. It's about 5 miles down the road. If we stick to the pavement, we should be able to outpace whatever's out there." As we set off down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. The attacks on our campsite, the damaged car, it all seemed too deliberate, too calculated for a mere animal. We'd gone about a mile when we heard it, that same bone-chilling scream from the night before. Only this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many, coming from all around us. "Oh, God," Zoe whimpered. "They're all around us." I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding. That's when I saw them, dark shapes moving through the forest on either side of the road. They were pacing us, staying just out of clear sight. "Don't run," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "Just keep walking, steady pace." We pressed on, acutely aware of the creatures flanking us. Occasionally, one would let out a low growl or snap a branch, as if to remind us of their presence. The tension was unbearable. Every step felt like it might be our last, every moment pregnant with the possibility of attack. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we saw it. The ranger station, a welcome beacon of civilization in the wilderness. As we approached the building, I risked a glance back at the forest. What I saw made my blood run cold. They were there, standing at the tree line, dozens of them, tall and impossibly thin, their bodies a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. And they were watching us, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that defied explanation. We burst into the ranger station, gasping and sobbing. The startled ranger on duty took one look at our terrified faces and immediately called for backup. As we waited for help to arrive, huddled together in the safety of the station, I couldn't shake the memory of those creatures watching us from the forest. Whatever they were, they had let us go. And somehow, I knew this wasn't the end. This encounter had changed us all, opened our eyes to a world beyond what we thought we knew. And as I sat there, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced, I realized that our understanding of the natural world and our place in it would never be the same again.